attendees are going to. And then I'll be back to showing.
May I ask those present to take a seat? We will be beginning. Kindly take a seat so we can begin.
You think you're gonna in and out and maybe catch up with some people before everybody leaves this afternoon? You can go to the fifth floor, 505. There is going to be live streaming. Yeah. So if you want to, make some space available in this room for people who are gonna be in full attendance, like Youngju. She's been waiting for this webinar. She even took up work today. She got this webinar. Hey, I next to baby.
Okay, we really need to we'll get to start. Well, welcome to all of you here today, as well as those of you watching online. I'm so glad that we have this ability now to be both present in person and present virtually. All are welcome to this event here at the Elliott School of International Affairs. My name is Lindner. I'm a research professor here and director of Partnerships for International Strategies in Asia, PISA, which, as the name implies, is a program that collaborates with universities, research institutes, non-governmental organizations, and governmental agencies in Asia to address the emerging global issues of our time. We're honored therefore, to partner with Women Cross DMZ, Korea Peace Now, and a host of co-convening organizations that have made these events possible. For 70 years, as you know, the people of the North Korean Peninsula have lived under a cloud of unresolved conflict that breaks out in crisis, as today, as these days, from time to time. Yesterday, many of us engaged, despite the heat and humidity, in a day of action to call for peace and an end to the state of war. Today, we can take some time to educate ourselves, to reflect, and to deepen our understanding of the prospects and challenges involved in shifting from an armistice to a peace agreement. To lead us in this endeavor, I am pleased to turn the podium to Christine An, founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War, to reunite families, and to ensure women's leadership in peace building. In 2015, she led 30 international women peacemakers from 15 countries across the demilitarized zone from North Korea to South Korea. Some of the members of that delegation are here with us today. They walked with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ and held women's peace symposia in Pyongyang and Seoul, where they discussed the impact of the unresolved war on women's lives. Christine is the co-coordinator of the global campaign, Korea Peace Now, Women Mobilizing to End the War, which Women Cross DMZ launched in 2019 with a coalition of women's organizations, including the Nobel Women's Initiative, Korean Women's Movement for Peace, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and literally a host, quite a long list of organizations that she has been a spark plug in organizing and making an impact worldwide. She has been featured in many forms of the media, and most notably in today's Washington Post. And also in an article earlier this week, which was very important because you'll actually see wonderful photos of Christine as a young girl. So I highly recommend that you look up that article. Without further ado, let me bring Christine on to the podium to introduce our speaker.
Yay. Thank you so much, Linda and PISA and George Washington University for our partnership, for your partnership in planning and organizing this conference. My deepest gratitude to Linda Yar, who has been a lifelong friend for the Korea peace movements for generations. It is the reason we are having this conference today at GW. And really, she was the catalyst for that op-ed in the USA Today. And yes, there were very cute pics of me. For once, I am humanized in the media. Good morning and welcome to the last day of some very inspiring days. It really was just phenomenal yesterday. When we started to conceive of this conference, we felt it was important to bring together a combination of experts who are changing the way we all think about the Korean War and its ongoing impact, and offering new thinking to help us get beyond this dangerous stalemate. We wanted to center the stories of individuals whose families have been torn apart by war and the obstacles they continue to face due to the absence of peace, as well as humanitarian experts who understand intimately how US policies continue to shape the day-to-day existence of North Korean people. As the situation on the Korean Peninsula reaches dangerous levels, we felt it was important to hear from military experts and nuclear scientists how peace and normalization can go a long way towards taking the threat of nuclear war off the table. So that's a preview of what we will learn today from the best, the brightest, and the most compelling. But to help us situate us on the 70th anniversary of the Armistice, there was no doubt in our minds who we needed to deliver the keynote. We had to invite the great historian, Bruce Cumings, whose works have enlightened students, activists, and the American public. Not only is Bruce the foremost scholar on the Korean War, he has educated and trained 2 generations of Korea scholars, whose works continue to deepen and sharpen our understanding of the enormous consequences of this war. Professor Cumings' lifelong scholarly work on modern Korean history, 20th century international history, US-East Asia relations, East Asian political economy, and American foreign relations is, in a word, incomparable. We've read many of them, such as Korea's Place in the Sun, A Modern History, The Origins of the Korean War, North Korea, Another Country, and so many more. Anytime he writes a new article on a development on the Korean Peninsula, I always make time to read it because his analysis is always so incisive, provides deep historical context, and is morally grounded in the values we all need so much today, in peace and in justice. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to the inimitable and honorable Bruce Cumings.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. I really admire you so much for all the work that you do. And Linda Yar, thank you also. I have one question. How do I move this screen forward?
Sublime to the mundane.
Oh, right there.
Then you can use the arrow.
Oh, okay, great. I think most of you have had a chance to read this particular slide, I want to try to get across one major thing this morning, and that is that the chance of nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula and in its vicinity is still very strong, and it would be the most terrible war in history. And I have to say that the United States government, all presidents, Republicans and Democrats, consistently try to intimidate North Korea by flying nuclear-capable bombers into the Korean theater. Last week, the USS Kentucky, a nuclear sub, was in Korean ports. And the Pentagon always lets us know that these are nuclear-capable weapons or systems. And this has been true since 1951, as I will try to show today. Nothing's happening. When I push it, nothing's happening.
Okay, it says this to everyone. Now we see what happened.
One of the still unresolved matters regarding the armistice is whether the North Koreans and Chinese were intimidated by President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, with their many threats to use nuclear weapons to end the war. They had a policy of massive retaliation, as it was called, and Eisenhower and Dulles both claimed after the armistice was achieved that it was their nuclear terror, frankly, that brought North Korea to sign the armistice. At the time, the administration got newspapers to feature atomic tests in the Nevada desert. Some of you may have seen the wonderful film Oppenheimer that opened last week in the Nevada desert. Well, they announced for the first time that the US had a nuclear cannon. They fired a nuclear shot of 10 kilotons in the Nevada desert. And this photo was on the front pages of many newspapers. A few days later, that particular story was on May 26th, 1953 in the New York Times. And a few days later, the Times reported a mighty atom blast that many thought was a hydrogen bomb. It wasn't, it was just a very large atomic bomb. As you know, at that time, the US and the Soviets were just freely blowing off nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Soviets, I believe, at one point tested a 50 megaton nuclear weapon in the atmosphere. And the radiation that flowed from these tests is still something that's an issue. I was just listening to NPR the other day, where people from Nevada were talking about all the cancers that had appeared in their families. Anyway, in spite of all of this nuclear hoopla, there isn't any evidence that these nuclear threats made any difference in North Korea and China signing the armistice. Basically, they made the decision to sign it in late March. 2 months before all this mayhem in the month of May. And probably the most important factor was the death of Stalin in early March. Stalin, really from the start of the war, as we know from a letter he wrote in 1950, was just happy as he could be that the US was bogged down in a war in Korea that turned out to be unwinnable. The Eisenhower administration also attacked huge dams in North Korea, 5 or 6 of them in May of 1953, just when you had a rice harvest being planted. These are, in the literature, often called irrigation dams, but in fact, they were very large dams along the lines of the Hoover Dam or the Great Sweho Dam on the Yalu River, which we also bombed, although we never bombed the Chinese side of that. The Pujan River Dam was an enormous dam. I have some of the data at the bottom of this slide. U.S. official Air Force history just crowed about these attacks on the dams. 59 Thunderjets hit the containing wall of Toksan on May 13th, just again a few days from the explosion of these weapons in the Nevada desert. It scooped clean 27 miles of river valley and sent water rushing even into Pyongyang, with 70 villages flooded. When you look at the New York Times, our paper of record from that period, you find that they had war news right on the front page, but in 4 different fonts: a larger font, smaller still, and tiny. And the attacks on the dams made the tiny fonts with no commentary whatsoever, no news story. These were war crimes under a 1949 international protocol. There's no question about it. We're not talking about little dams like the Holland dams that the US said would be a war crime when Hitler hit those dams. We're talking about major dams. This is the Toksan Dam having been breached. Here is Kim Il-sung signing the armistice. And this is the American delegation at the signing. Notice there are no South Koreans present. South Korea refused to sign the armistice and still has never signed the armistice. But I wish there had been one South Korean in this picture. That would have been Baek Sun-yup, who was often the sole Korean surrounded by 8 or 10 Americans as the token South Korean part of this delegation. But everything was completely controlled by Americans. U.S. Air Force ran out of targets in North Korea within a couple of months of the opening of the war and proceeded to pulverize North Korea for the next 3 years. They dropped the last large bomb about an hour before the armistice came into effect on July 27th. I have data on this slide regarding the enormous tonnage of bombs dropped on Korea, a much smaller country than Germany. And of course, napalm was used throughout the war. And military journals at the time talked about it as a wonder weapon that scared the enemy. It is fundamentally another war crime committed by the US in North Korea. And most Americans know nothing about it. They are always surprised to hear that 16 cities were razed to the ground in North Korea. This is from US Air Force official data. Here is Pyongyang, sometime in 1953. Here's the port of Wonsan, which was not only bombed by the Air Force, but shelled time and time again with American warships standing offshore. This is the former Japanese government general building, where its shape is of the first character of Nippon when you look at it from the air. It was the central government building in South Korea into the early 1990s, torn down. It was built by German architects, I believe, in 1915, a beautiful building. I often read that both South and North Korea were completely destroyed by the Korean War. In fact, South Korea had a lot of damage in the northern third of the peninsula where North Koreans and Chinese occupied. But no Air Force was able to systematically control no communist Air Force was able to systematically control the air in South Korea. And so the damage was relatively small compared to what happened in North Korea. This is the building after the war. You can see that it was burned, but it was still standing. This is a comic book from the time. I am getting older and older, and I'm old enough to have read comic books during the Korean War. This isn't one of mine, but it's a comic book about a GI being hit by friendly fire by American napalm. This is Michael Walzer's book. I've taught this book so much that he really owes me some money. It is a study of the just war tradition. And he's really the one, much more expert than I am on issues like war crimes, who argues that our bombing of the North was, in fact, a war crime. I have 2 or 3 photos to show you from Chris Marker's lovely book called Koreans. He originally published it in French in 1958 or 59. He visited North Korea in 1957 and took these pictures of the rebuilding still going on in Pyongyang. Chris Marker, of course, was a great filmmaker and photographer who died 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Absolutely brilliant man. This is on the left, the government building that still you see every time there's a big march through downtown Pyongyang, having, I think, a priority on getting it restored at the very beginning of the reconstruction. These are, I believe, a mother, a daughter, and a granddaughter, widows. One of the terrible things about this war in both North and South is how many mothers became widows, how many wives became widows, how many children became orphans. As many of you probably know, the North Koreans had a big program to send orphans to Eastern Europe for their education. And we had more than 100,000 Korean orphans come to the United States under the auspices of various agencies. One of the international conferences that scholars know about, but most people don't because nothing happened on the American side, is the Geneva Conference in 1954. It was to work out peace arrangements in both Korea and Vietnam, with Vietnam having won the war against the French after the Dien Bien Phu battle. Secretary of State Dulles, however, had no intention of signing a peace treaty with North Korea or China. And he succeeded in dividing Vietnam instead of what would have happened if the battlefield results had held, which would be that Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi would have taken over the government of the South. It's a very interesting conference in that respect because the Russians and the Chinese more or less went along with the Americans in pushing for a division of Vietnam. And it was at that time that the US committed to the well-being and longevity of the Saigon regime. So it's very important in the development of the American war in Vietnam. I interviewed Alexis Johnson in 1986, a very interesting man who had actually been in the American consulate in Korea in the late 1930s before the American diplomats were shipped out by the Japanese. Anyway, he told me that they had no intention of doing anything regarding a peace treaty at Geneva. So I asked him, how do you prepare for a conference when you have no hope that negotiations are going to change anything? Well, you make your speeches and you also try to make sure that Foreign Minister Pyun is well established and knows what he's supposed to do. And then he kind of paused and coughed and said, don't let Syngman Rhee sabotage it. So nothing happened, and here we are in 2023. The first episode of nuclear blackmail was Operation Hudson Harbor in the fall of 1951, in which the US sent so-called dummy A-bombs, big TNT bombs, over North Korea on simulated atomic bombing runs to see to see the circumference of destruction that would occur if an atomic bomb was used, and whether large numbers of troops could be identified and hit with atomic bombs. As you can see from the second paragraph, this was a very serious project, extremely secret until it was declassified about 30 or 40 years later. And of course, A-bombs were not used because large masses of enemy troops were extremely rare. I would say they were a lot rarer when they see an atomic bomb coming off of a B-29. But one can imagine the leaders in Pyongyang observing a lone B-29 simulating the attack lines of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, never knowing whether it was fake or whether it was real. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the things left out of the film, but in the book based on the film, based on the book, that film could never have happened if it had not been for the book by Deibert and Martin Sherwin, who are both good friends of mine. Marty, unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago. Oppenheimer went to Korea as part of Project Vista, which was the beginning of thinking about the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And early that year, Samuel Cohen observed the battles for recapturing Seoul and thought there ought to be a way to destroy the enemy soldiers without destroying the city, and became the father of the neutron bomb. One of the things that I'm always thinking about, and hardly anybody else seems to be thinking about, is that Korea has been a centerpiece of American nuclear diplomacy and nuclear policy going back to 1951. It almost never gets any attention in the press. The most terrible thing the US ever did regarding the armistice is to break it so that it could install nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. Section 13D restricted both sides from introducing new types of weapons into the Korean theater. And Admiral Radford, who was a real hawk, thought there were ways to get around it. Dulles, who was spent most of his career as a lawyer on Wall Street, realized that this would be a violation of 13D to install nuclear weapons. They tried to argue the communist side had violated 13D, but all it had done is introduce MiG-19s or 21s, new jet aircraft, but not a qualitative change like nuclear weapons. But anyway, the British protested, but the US went right ahead and relieved itself of its Armistice Treaty obligations. And in August, NSC 5702/2 approved the stationing of nuclear weapons in Korea. One of the major goals, which I did not realize until I read the National Security Council documents at the Eisenhower Library. Boy, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Abilene, but there was one cafe and it was about 110 degrees when I was there. That has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Anyway, I found out that a major goal, particularly of Dulles, was to leash Syngman Rhee and keep them from attacking the North. This starts in 1953, right after the war ends, and it goes right into 1957. And I'm quoting Dulles here. In 1957, that Syngman Rhee might start a war. 2 weeks later, if war were to start in Korea, it was going to be very hard indeed to determine which side had begun the war. And Dulles even suggested that the North Koreans would put South Korean uniforms on their soldiers, infiltrate them into the South, and then attack the North to justify another war. This was somebody who was on the 38th parallel a week before the Korean War began. And I think it's something he thought about the rest of his life. Exactly how did this war begin? Anyway, very quickly in early 1958, the US put Honest John missiles. And then later Matador cruise missiles, which also were meant to deter China and the Soviet Union. And soon American war plans, and I've seen these war plans, there isn't any question about it. The ROK divisions and the US divisions were keyed to the early use of nuclear weapons in case a North Korea attacked. One of the things I believe we will discover when North Korea is finally opened up for an inquiry is that no country on the face of the earth in world history has ever built underground the way North Korea has. They have 15,000 underground facilities of a national security nature. They have enormous underground facilities for their military. Kim Il-sung said around 1962 or 3, a few years after these weapons were in the South, we have no defense against them. We have to build underground. It's our only defense. Freeman Dyson, in a great book called Weapons and Hope, Dyson was a physicist at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and a colleague of Oppenheimer. He said the most dangerous nuclear weapons were so-called backpack nukes. They weigh about 60 pounds and yet have the same explosive force as the Hiroshima bomb. One soldier can put this on his back or in a Jeep and move it around, which they did in Korea. And there was always a danger that somehow it might fall into the hands of the North Koreans. The American assumption from 1951 to 2006 was that China and the Soviet Union would not go to the threshold of nuclear war to defend North Korea. And North Korea had no nuclear weapons. And so you could do pretty much what you wanted with nuclear weapons, unlike, say, the Central Front in Europe, where the use of nuclear weapons would immediately bring the other side to use nuclear weapons. That's one of the key reasons why North Korea was subject to this extended nuclear deterrence for so long. In 1991, the Bush administration decided to withdraw all the tactical other nuclear weapons from South Korea, as well as from around the world. And that was because of new precision-guided conventional weapons with high explosives, which could do the same thing a small tactical nuclear weapon could do without the radiation and other attendant problems. I still don't know whether we maintained nuclear weapons on the bombers that the US keeps at Kunsan Air Base. I just don't know. It's never, as far as I know, been classified whether they do or not. But during the Pueblo crisis in 1968, Richard Nixon wanted to, it's Lyndon Johnson, I'm trying to think back to that distant point. Anyway, the American president, he asked about attacking North Korea with our fighters at Kunsan Air Base, bombers, and he was told they all carried nuclear weapons. The last paragraph is very important. The withdrawal doesn't matter. The US has subs and airplanes, fighters and bombers that can be deployed to the Korean theater any day of the week. And all presidents have done this. President Biden just got done with this USS Kentucky. First time in 40 years that a nuclear sub has stopped in Korea. Where's Christine? I'm amazed that I'm keeping to my time.
You're what?
Keeping to my time. I think what I have to say here is very important. First of all, how easy it is to get into a war and how desperately hard it is to get out. MacArthur said when, on Monday or Tuesday after the war had begun, he was in Tokyo and he said, I can handle this with one hand tied behind my back. A month later, he was saying that the North Korean army was functioning much better than the Japanese army in its infantry tactics. And here we are in 2023. The US refused to recognize the North Korean regime when it came to power, which was not in 1948, but in the interim Central People's Committee in February 1946, when Kim Il-sung became head of that. And in effect, both Kim and Syngman Rhee were the odds-on favorites to lead both governments in 1948, in early 1946, in other words, about 6 months after World War II ended. General Hodge, John R. Hodge, refused to recognize this interim People's Committee, and that began almost 80 years of non-recognition and sanctions. Sanctions began in 1949, before the Korean War, and North Korea is the most sanctioned country on the face of the earth. And guess what? There's no evidence that they have ever done anything positive as a result of those sanctions. Now, in 1994 and 1998 to 2000, the Clinton administration engaged directly with North Korea, although Jimmy Carter had to intervene in 1994 to stop a war from happening. Clinton had approved a preemptive strike on the North Korean plutonium facility. But the North agreed to freeze that plutonium facility for 8 years. And in the last 2 years of that decade, there was a movement toward ending the armistice and getting a peace agreement, toward four-party talks between North and South Korea, the US, and China, which met a number of times. And above all, a deal on basically buying out North Korea's missiles. People have completely forgotten that. Madeleine Albright went to Pyongyang in November of 2000, and Bill Clinton was supposed to follow in December to sign this agreement in Pyongyang. But what everybody does remember is the 2000 election was the most absurd election in American history, where the Supreme Court gave the presidency to George W. Bush, who proceeded to demolish the Clinton Korea policy. Thanks to John Bolton in particular, they broke the 1994 agreement, so North Korea got back all its plutonium, and they refused to go forward with the missile agreement. Now, this is something that I said in the New York Review of Books a few years ago, and a very good scholar wrote in and said, this is totally unfair to the Bush administration. I don't know how you can be any more unfair to the Bush administration than it deserves, because it not only prolonged the war in Korea and led to North Korea becoming a nuclear power, but it invaded Iraq, and that became a complete and utter disaster. So direct talks with the North at the highest level get things done. That's the history of the 1990s. Hasn't happened since. Barack Obama and George Biden. What was that, a Freudian slip? I don't actually include Joe Biden with George Bush in any sentence that I can think of. I think he's done a good job. But he hasn't done a good job, and neither has Obama or Trump or Biden, in constantly intimidating North Korea with nuclear bombers and refusing to talk directly to them. I mean, this is complete Orwellian double talk that the Biden administration is involved in. So we are ready to have unrestricted, unconditional talks with North Korea at any time about denuclearization. So we're completely stymied. North Korea is a nuclear power. It will always be a nuclear power. And that has to be put to the side so that other things can be accomplished rather than trying to get them to give up something that none of us would give up. If you're intimidated by nuclear weapons for 70 or 80 years, Deterrence 101 tells you that's what you need, your own nuclear weapons. I don't want to excuse the North Koreans. They are author of most of their own problems. But it doesn't matter who would be governing in Pyongyang under this kind of threat. First thing they would want as soon as possible is a nuclear weapon. Now think about this. The US sent 25,000 troops into South Korea in September 1945, September 9th. And 78 years later, we've got 28,000 still there. And war is still near. The intelligence director, Robert Gates, talked about how close we came to war with North Korea in 2010. And Leon Panetta, the defense secretary, told CNN that he had been within an inch of war for months with North Korea in 2012. To send troops in to block Kim Il-sung from taking over the peninsula, that's what the State Department thought. They thought there were thousands of guerrillas that were going to come in from Manchuria and take over Korea if we didn't send our troops in, which was not Roosevelt's policy, but it became Truman's policy. Something that looked small, be there for a few months, bring the troops home. And now we have the grandson of Kim Il-sung with nuclear weapons and ICBMs. It's just a catastrophic policy failure. Chris Marker, you can see what he said there in his book. The book came out in French, and I took 2 years of French, but he's got a lot of abstruse sentences in it, and I never quite understood what was in his book. I could see the photos, but not the text. But in South Korea, his book on North Korea was translated in 1998, a beautiful edition with wonderful photos and in English. So I finally figured out what Chris Marker was trying to say. He talked about a passion for understanding those that we disagree with, those that we don't like, instead of conserving and defending ourselves and denying this kind of contact. So we end with an epitaph for Americans, North Koreans, defying every American expectation and desire that they erase themselves, and Americans refusing to seek an understanding with their very old adversary, still with no passion or understanding. On that point, I'm very proud that a couple of my students, especially Susie Kim, she's done 2 books on North Korea that represent a kind of investigative history. But they stand almost alone because we have so little investigative reporting on North Korea. It's just a crime. I mean, here we are still at war with North Korea. A nuclear war could break out, and we hardly ever get anything but propaganda. The New York Times had a 2-page bunch of photos and some text on the armistice yesterday. And it was all about the North Korean defectors, how they couldn't get a hot shower till they got into South Korea. Things like that just always pop up and get nowhere when it comes to understanding what is actually happening in North Korea and between North Korea and South Korea and North Korea and the US. So no passion for understanding, and we remain in denial about a conflict almost 80 years old and within an inch of breaking out again. Thank you. I'll take your questions now.
Go ahead. Could you talk a bit about the sanctions and their impact on the people?
Well, I don't really know much about the impact of the sanctions on the North Korean people because we get so little reporting on it. I'm sure it's been a fact for decades that poor people with no power, are the ones who suffer most under these sanctions. But I really, I don't have firsthand knowledge or repertorial knowledge of exactly how these sanctions are affecting ordinary people. But the sanctions are just draconian. I mean, North Korea supposedly has not been able to export any coal or import any coal, which is, of course, unfortunately, their main energy source. What is interesting to me is that the North Koreans are doing rather well under extreme sanctions. A friend of mine was in Pyongyang in the last few months, and he was flabbergasted by the building that has been going on. I mean, Pyongyang is always the model city that they throw investment into, and God knows what's going on in the countryside. But I think the practical point, since we're not going to be able to do anything about those poor folks, as long as the sanctions exist, is to have talks to get the sanctions lifted, apart from requiring North Korea to give up its ace in the hole, which are nuclear weapons that deter the US from attacking. Yes.
For the next year election, only 1 year left under the diplomatic administration. There was no Korean policy and nothing. Do you expect George Biden will change his policy for Korea, please?
No,
No.
I was about to say next question. Christine the other day referred to this as strategic patience. And that was also the Obama policy after the so-called Leap Day agreement fell apart in 2016. Here we are 7 years later, there's been no serious movement toward direct talks. It's not really strategic patience, it's very patient, paying no attention really. But as a strategy, it doesn't work at all. It hasn't worked to bring North Korea to the negotiating table. I don't know what George Biden thinks, but I know that President Obama, I think, just got very tired of the North Koreans. They were so stupid at the beginning of his administration to denounce him as a warmonger and various other epithets, even before he had done anything. And I remember thinking to myself, well, you know, whoever's advising the leader of North Korea, that was just profoundly stupid. Why not wait a little while before you call him a warmonger after there's some evidence? And I think he did a lot, you know, with Cuba and other Iran and other so-called pariah states, but I think he just put North Korea on the back burner. I want to say, I haven't mentioned anything about Donald Trump. But when I give a talk like this, almost always someone asks me, you know, what about Trump and Kim Jong-un? You know, wasn't that wonderful that they got together in Hanoi and so on? You have to understand that Trump did that so he could be in the Klieg lights of world attention. His every move being photographed and talked about for days on end. He had no intention whatsoever of making a deal with North Korea. And I think it probably hurt Kim Jong-un a lot with his fellow leaders that he came back from Hanoi with nothing and with a very bad snub when Trump didn't even sit around to have lunch with him. But Trump is a complete menace. He's worse now than he was before, which is really saying something. And if the American people elect him, you know, anything could happen. Anything could happen. We could have a dictatorship. Yes.
Yes, speaking of characters, could you go into a little more detail about what John Bolton has been up to for the last decade and a half, or 10 decades, or however long he's been alive?
Well, Bolton was a member of the extreme right for a long time. And I I sort of thought he was just, unimportant and uninteresting and a blowhard. But I read his memoir of his service in the Bush administration. And he's you should see it if you haven't, he's very upfront about how he wanted to destroy the 1994 framework agreement that froze North Korea's plutonium. He doesn't quite say why, but as a lifelong anti-communist, I think he just believes any deals with communists are bad and they're going to be broken. But it's stunning the way he just comes right out and says, I was out to break that agreement. And George W. Bush, who was a complete know-nothing in foreign affairs, was led around by the nose by Dick Cheney and John Bolton and people like that. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I came in late. A lot of other people did, so I missed your beginning. Do you have a place online or something where we can go back and review these wonderful revelations worked so hard to bring to the public here today?
Well, it's all I can do to keep up with email. So I'm not, hold on, let me, yeah. I was just going to say that the very good journal, Critical Asian Studies, is going to put this stuff online. Yes, sir.
How would you assess within the United States public opinion about the Korean War, or at least knowledge of it? Do you think it's do you think more people are aware and also truly understanding what's going on, or not?
No, fewer people are aware. A long time has passed since the Korean War. It's called the Forgotten War. Korean veterans really gave that name to it, I think, as far back as the 70s. And it became a moniker for the war. But the fact is, it's an unknown war in the United States. It was fought under censorship by Douglas MacArthur and received in the US throughout the McCarthy period. Joe McCarthy was a major figure and a dominant figure throughout the entire Korean War. He didn't meet his end until 1954. And even a liberal journal like the New York Times criticized people for protesting the war. In 1950, Paul Robeson led a protest in Harlem, I think in August of 1950, and the New York Times denounced that protest. You could go to jail, lose your job. I was just talking to one of the people sitting next to me, that Eye of Stone's Hidden History of the Korean War, which is still a very interesting book. He took that to 33 publishers before he finally found a publisher in the early 50s. I mean, it's hard to overestimate the repression in this country during the McCarthy era. You can get a sense of it in the Oppenheimer film, where even the father of the atomic bomb and the most prestigious physicist in the world, Robert Oppenheimer, was himself a victim of McCarthyite red baiting. It's a very dramatic part of the end of the film. So you have a never known war combined with generations going by. And I think the one element of the American public that is very aware of the Korean War is Korean Americans, who are much more numerous than they ever were before. One of the most gratifying things about working on Korea is to see the enormous impact of Korean Americans and Koreans in our culture. Every time I open up the New York Times book review, I see another novel by a Korean woman. And throughout all walks of life, Korean, boy, I'm giving this microphone a hard time. Throughout all walks of professional life, you see Korean Americans. So organizations like Christine has founded and run are very important, but you can tell they mainly appeal to Korean Americans. If I ask the average American a question about the Korean War, I'm going to get back something that couldn't possibly be correct. Yes.
I think in kind of building on that idea of a treaty, a simple document says at the end of the war, doesn't attempt to try to resolve the other multitude of issues versus solve all the multitude of issues, and then there'll be a peace treaty. Where you might stand on that. And then the second thing is the argument that many people would give, and it's Congress, I think, against a treaty, that deterrence has kept peace over the 70 years, that would be their argument. And how do you get past that wall, which is a big wall, to try and move towards a peace? So,
Well, I think you're right that there are more important issues than the peace agreement, simply because we have an armistice that has held the peace for 70 years with all its problems. And you're right, the US has deterred a new war in Korea. But the result of that deterrence has been the emergence of North Korea as a major nuclear power. And I don't see that as a success. I do think direct talks that would lead to normalization of relations with the US after 80 years almost would be a good idea. And a peace agreement or treaty. When I keep saying peace agreement, it's because a treaty has to be ratified by the Senate, and it probably wouldn't ratify it. That was hashed out in the late 90s. And I agree with you. It's a kind of secondary or tertiary thing. It's important to get it done, but much more important would be to establish normal relations with North Korea.
they may lead to that.
It could lead to it. I think when you look at the policies that Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun followed, you see what a tragedy it was that Al Gore was not elected, because he would have continued the Clinton policies. We would have kept a freeze on the plutonium, and you would have had the American president in sync with the Korean president, which is something that started really in 1998 with Clinton and Kim Dae-jung. So the Bush administration has so much to answer for regarding Iraq and North Korea and other things. Yes, sir.
I attended your student Jiyeon's report on his dissertation in 2019, the rise of the South Korean left, the death of unitary socialism, and the origins of the Korean War. And I'm wondering if the idea of unitary socialism could serve as a uniting factor in a restoration of a united Korea.
Well, it certainly could if you had a socialist get voted in to power in Seoul. But even without that, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun did so much, along with Kim Jong-il, to move engagement and successes forward. My student Kyuhyun, one of my favorite students, wrote a dissertation on the South Korean Labor Party. And I disagreed with most of his conclusions. He thought the South Korean Labor Party was responsible for the rebellion on Jeju Island, and starting in 1948. And I tried to suggest that maybe they were the spark that set it off, but you can't have a rebellion like that when masses of people rebel by some, puppetry by the South Korean Labor Party. But he's a brilliant student, and he had evidence, and so he passed his dissertation and has been teaching at Yonsei University for 3 or 4 years. Yes, all the way in the back.
I was just curious about your opinions on the role of defense companies and their lobbies. Just knowing that they spend hundreds of millions of dollars. I think about $2.5 billion in the last 2 decades to influence foreign policy. What role that plays.
Well, that's an interesting question. It's almost an archaeological question, because the Defense Department budget and the many defense firms that supply it haven't been an issue in this country really since Seymour Melman and a few others passed away, tried to bring it up as an issue. It was a big issue in the 70s. Not an issue anymore. I don't know of a single congressman or woman who protests the $880 billion defense bill that was just before the Congress, $880 billion. And it's just a gravy train for Lockheed and General Dynamics and Boeing. And it no longer gets the inquiry or examination that it used to, except maybe in marginal publications. It's just an accepted fact of American life. And the one thing most people don't understand is the military-industrial complex began with the Korean War, not with World War II. It is an artifact of the enormous quadrupling of defense spending during the Korean War. And it's been a gravy train ever since. I almost, I don't invest in stocks. I used to sometimes. I always shied away from Boeing and General Dynamics on principled grounds. I thought I'd be a rich man if I hadn't done it. I lived in Seattle for 10 years when I was at the University of Washington. And it was Boeing's company town in the 70s and early 80s before it became Microsoft and Nintendo and above all Amazon's company town. The dean of my department or my section at the university admonished me not to criticize Boeing because Boeing was going to give $50,000 to some school. I mean, it's that direct. It's that direct. So I don't know. That's a lousy answer to your question. I wish the answer were that a lot of people are up in arms about the military-industrial complex, but it's just become an accepted fact of American life. Yes.
You say today that the U.S. keeping troops or remaining in South Korea has more to do or less to do with the spread of communism and more to do with where Korea is geographically in terms of the world and maintaining the world. And then kind of connected to that is given the rising tensions between the United States and China, how do you see that impacting any hope of normalization of United States relationships?
Well, it's a very good question. The problem with our troops in Korea is there's always a new rationale for why we need to keep them there. And for the last decade or so, it's been China. One of the few absolutely true things Xi Jinping has said is when he talked about being roundly contained by American forces in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, or the Indo-Pacific, whatever they call it. The troops now might well be used in a battle over Taiwan, which Koreans don't want. They don't want to be drawn into a war over Taiwan, but got 28,000 troops there, 50,000 in Japan, mostly in Okinawa. And one of the great dangers is that a war over Taiwan would become a general Northeast Asian war. But the troops are there for that reason and to support the South Korean government. One of the curious things to me after, again, almost 80 years of US-Korean relations is that officials in Washington still speak of South Korea as if it were a child. We can't take our hands off the handlebars. Maybe we can remove the training wheels next, a decade from now, things like that. That's what they say privately. They don't want Koreans to be alone together. And that's a central part of keeping 28,000 troops there. Now, they're not worth anything in a war. They're worth a little bit, but if a war developed, a ground war, you'd get the troops from Okinawa, you would get enormous numbers of troops from other bases and from the US. They're a kind of earnest of our intent to defend South Korea. And they're a major containment point for China to look at. The last part of your question, if we had a general rapprochement with China, then that would encourage US relations with North Korea. One of the things most people don't know is you look back at Kissinger in 1972 when he went, 71, 72, when he went to China. He met with Kim Il-sung in Beijing secretly. And there was talk of unifying Korea at that time. Kissinger later denied this, but Zhou Enlai said that he met with Kim Il-sung. Anyway, don't quote me on that because I don't have any evidence other than what Zhou Enlai has said. But the fact is, my point is, the Korean situation was immediately seen as part of the U.S.-China situation. Yes.
So with the increasing transparency, the efficacy of the U.S. moral oversight, the entire code, since WikiLeaks, and recently led by China, moves to be more independent from the U.S. Do you think that it's possible to have peace on the Korean Peninsula without U.S. oversight or commitment?
Well, I mean, the U.S. has played such a huge role in Korea for almost 80 years, as I keep saying, that the U.S. would probably have to be part of any settlement on the Korean Peninsula. But the ultimate goal, it seems to me, and I said this back when I was a graduate student writing my dissertation, what Koreans have said and what they did say back then is Korea exists for the Koreans. It does not exist for Americans. And if Koreans were to take their destiny into their own hands, that might involve asking the US troops to go home. But I think practically and politically speaking, probably the US would be part of any settlement. One of the things I didn't mention is that what American officials say is if we get a peace agreement to replace the armistice, the next thing will be the North Koreans will demand that American troops go home. That's a completely specious argument. They've been demanding that we go home since 1945. And we haven't gone home. We don't have to go home when the North Koreans demand that we go home. So it's a stupid argument, but that's what they say. It's as if it's another domino falling in the direction of North Korean interests.
Let me please join me in thanking Professor Cumings. Not only have you revealed to us how much we don't know, most of us, about the history and what the future prospects are, but I think we all come away feeling very chastened, if not frightened, about the current situation and how tenuous the fate of the world is, given the situation on the Korean Peninsula. So thank you so much, Professor Cumings, for coming today. And we look forward to reading the article once it comes out in Critical Asian Studies. I'd like to turn now to our first panel. This is a panel that will bring to light for us some of the human impacts of this very tenuous situation on the Korean Peninsula. And I'd like to turn to Jennifer Deibert, who is with American Friends Service Committee. She will be moderating the current panel and will introduce the participants. Thank you. Jennifer.
They're all in the minds.
Q&A, can they get set up with that, please?
This. These ones don't work. I didn't think it before. They're. So, yeah, they'll have to use the. It wasn't. Yeah, do you have?
Irish.
Yeah, if it's just me.
I can help, I can help right now, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah.
And room 505, before, there are a lot of information. So I know everybody wanted to picture with Professor Cumings, but if you, and you're able to ask questions at room 505, wanna use room 505 center there.
Well, thank you.
Using a portable mic, right?
Yeah.
We also turn on the mic volumes.
Or as high as they can go.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Oh, so we can't, this is a fire lane.
Okay, this is fire lane.
So like they will have to go in the back.
Can you find Austin?
Yeah.
You want water? Yeah, we are.
I was about to do that. There should stay very close though. Yeah, if you can untangle these and plug them in. Then I don't think you can plug them. It's behind.
Okay.
So you want it to
That'd be the
be
same.
some of them don't.
She needs to come.
Here, this is part.
Problem.
Maybe I'll sit over here on this. Did that bother you? Okay, it's a crack in the middle and then, yeah. I'm superstitious. Chair, yeah, yeah.
That's not ours.
I have some water, but Kiwi wants water.
Sure. Yeah.
The other chair is orange.
Okay. Test.
Test, test,
The other way.
test.
But that one is not ours. I don't know who said it.
No, I don't know.
Yeah, it's not straight.
Oh, that's yours.
If you want to. If you want to.
That was amazing.
Otherwise, they're gonna lose it. Here's mine.
Was that? No, I have notes. I need notes. Oh. I do this, they're always on. Yes.
Linda? Are you the tech guru? Who is going to be operating these? So I can say next and all that.
I can.
You'll do it? Okay, that's not the starting point. Should I come help you?
Yeah, why don't you?
Go back. That is actually a separate document. That's the last one. There should be two PDFs.
Could you? I'm not sure how to. do it. Austin went downstairs.
Try that.
Oh,
Click there.
there we go.
Yeah.
We're good. I'll run the slides for him.
Online too. I didn't know if there was.
Yeah. Problem is hard to see them.
Yeah, they
Organized.
asked and I can read out something.
I thought I had it all together.
Yeah.
Oh. This is double.
This is a good one.
Confusing.
Question on. Mine.
Yeah. And it's some of the same questions they're asking.
So now
I have, because I'm a medical doctor, I'm qualified for humanitarian work. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, for the new one. They're an NGO. Yeah. No, I haven't applied. I have no people in it.
Kathy,
Ready? Okay. I think they'll be easy to get, easier. So I think
Okay. Let me.
with the letter. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize that they were going straight.
Yeah.
But it could be.
yes.
Yeah, your picture has to be within.
Okay, I hope you've had a chance to stretch a bit and take your places again for the first panel. Again, please take your seats so we can get started. Those of you online, thank you for your patience. Okay, well, let me hand the seated podium to Jennifer Deibert. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you to the professor for this sobering introduction we had this morning, and the big picture of where we've been from 1950 and before until now. And, you know, we could probably spend the entire day just on this panel, the human costs of the unended war, because there's so many, so broad and stretch from one generation to the next. But the three panelists we have here today carry three important stories of the impact of divided families, missing families, and working with families seeking health and well-being. And I hope this panel today can set the tone for the things we'll talk about in the afternoon, reminding us that behind the policies and sanctions and nuclear threats are people, and people who have been, are, and continue to feel the effects of the ongoing war and division. So I've asked the panelists here to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and we'll followed by a short question and answer session to dig deeper into these three stories that are all quite different but important. And first we'll have Rick Downs. He's the president and director of the Coalition of Families of Korean and Cold War POW MIAs, which is a nonprofit organization pursuing answers to the fate of American servicemen still missing in action during the Korean and Cold Wars. Rick has worked with multiple stakeholders inside and outside the government to declassify records that will aid in the search for remains, amendments to sanctions to exempt POW MIA operations, and resolutions calling for renewed joint remains recovery operations between the DPRK and the United States. Rick's story of searching for his father is an important story of the ongoing impact of the war. Thank you for being here to share.
Hello, is this close enough? Is this loud enough for everyone?
Closer.
Closer, okay. No. Better? Is this better? Okay, all right. Let me know if I need, just yell closer and ruin everything, but go ahead. Yes, as Jennifer mentioned, I'll begin with my personal story, but my story is one of thousands of stories. There are over 6,000 American servicemen still missing in action from the Korean War, over 6,000. And about 5,200 of them are believed to be inside North Korea, still in effect fighting the war from their graves in a sense, because they are kind of political prisoners, if you will, by both sides. And that should be very apparent. There is, in fact, in this story of trying to get access to them, the North Koreans DPRK has been more than cooperative in a number of times, unilateral returns and joint recovery operations since the 1990s. And it has often been, to my great heartbreak, to add to the heartbreak, that it's our own government that has often been the problem. And many would consider, despite any rhetoric, that it still is. So my father was 26 years old when he was recalled to the Air Force Reserves. He had served in World War II as a very young man, late teens, and then he, I don't know, I hope the math adds up. Then he, he was going with my mother at the time, and after the war, they got married, and they had this brilliant young boy. And then he went off to the University of Michigan, where he was hold many jobs. He was a good hockey player. He was the goalie on the 1951 national championship hockey team for University of Michigan. Yeah, it was pretty cool. And from there, he graduated and he got a job at Kaiser Auto. If anyone knows who Kaiser Auto is, you're as old as me. And he got his first day on the job my mother had to call him and say, "You have been recalled." And his response was he hadn't even sharpened his pencils yet, which is a tale in itself because they were using pencils in the offices in those days. So they, within probably 10 months, he was missing in action. And in that short time, they decided they wanted someone for me in case the worst happened. And so my mother became pregnant with my sister. I rue the day they made that decision, but no, just kidding. She's my partner in all this. But she was born a couple months after his loss. So she and I, and many of our stories are similar amongst the family members, especially this generation, our generation, each generation, whether it was the siblings or the children of these men, or now the nieces and nephews, and even the grandchildren of these men. They all have their own connections, and they are weakening in terms of, you know, the emotional stake, but they are all there. And so my relationship was that I got to be with him for a few years. And Dad left a void probably that, you know, she does not have, but she has, her scenario is that she never got to be held by her dad, and so forth. So that's the basic of my story, and it is the story retold thousands of times because it's not uncommon. In fact, one of the interesting things about this is that I can come across a family member, especially my own generation, and it doesn't matter our political views, our economic status, everything. It's like there's something there. Sorry, I'm a crier, and my sister makes fun of me. Anyway, I get over it quickly, so allow it to happen, okay? So he accomplished quite a bit in his short lifetime, and it would have been very special to see what he would have accomplished had he had a full life. And what my sister and I and all the rest of us would have been like if we didn't have to deal with that loss. So it's a trickling down thing. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, what would my, you know, nieces and nephews do if their mother hadn't had to do with it? How would they be? So on and so forth. So we would like to know, you know, you just can't ever know that. And you can't really focus on that because that's not reality. So you have to then deal, okay, now what do we do? Let's see. The need to know what happened is incredibly poignant and valid. In, you know, some people say, well, you don't get over it. You know, he's dead. You know, move on. We try, you know, we tried for 40, 50 years to do that. And then the Vietnam families started squawking about the MIAs from the Vietnam War. And we said, wait a minute, my dad's been missing for 40 years. And so we got together and we started saying, let's see what's happened. Well, if we can find out what happened, because it doesn't go away. It just doesn't go away. It's called the wound that never heals until you get that closure, which is happening. A lot of the guys who were brought back, about 800 or so unidentified from the war, could not be identified, buried in the Punchbowl Cemetery in Hawaii. And then DNA technology comes along, all these other aspects. Amazing what they can do now. They can tell from the bone, the diet of the person. And one of the interesting things is that they will get some remains that are obviously Asian, descent. And then say, wait a minute, this guy has a cornbread diet or something like that. And that's not Asian or whatever it might be. That's Iowa. So it's a Korean American. So they're about to send their remains back to South Korea and say these, repatriate them. They go, no, wait, this is an American who fought, a Korean American. So it's just amazing what they can do. But I'm sorry, I get off on track. But what would kind of a point that I want to make here is that if this was in the Roman times or the times of the Crusades, and my dad was lost in some French battle or something and never came home, or in Northern Africa, I could go and see if I could find him and bring him home. And because of the political situation, which was so well laid out there for all these decades, I cannot do that. None of us families can. We cannot do that. And part of why we're all here together is our unique pursuit of getting back into North Korea. And it's a common theme that we all work together on quite well. It's very impressive. So we want to do that. We want to get back. In 2016, I was able to travel with the Richardson Center for Global Engagement, which they had Bill Richardson as former governor and I think Secretary Treasurer for a while, but has a strong connection with North Korea. And it was in 2016, a panel like this, we've been going for quite a while here, that Dan Jasper, many of you know, introduced me to Governor Richardson and his Vice President, Mickey Bergman, in a back room here. And we talked and I said, I need to go to North Korea. I don't know if any of you know Bill Richardson, but he's a very casual guy. He's like this with his feet up on a desk, you know, with boots on from New Mexico. And he just looks over at Mickey and goes, can we do that? And Mickey takes about 3 seconds. And in 3 months, I was in Pyongyang. And anyway, so one of the impressive things about that, most meaningful, never mind the negotiations that we had about remains that unfortunately President Obama at the time would not approve. We had a little agreement with the North Koreans that later on the Trump administration did, and we got them back, 5 boxes. So that was a heartbreaker too. But anyway, the plane as it came into Pyongyang flew over an area where we think my dad's plane was. Yeah, so my quest got me 4,000 feet, you know, above, which would probably be the height that he would have bailed out if he did that, if he had the opportunity to do that. We're not quite sure if that's what happened. And to do that, and I just wanted a few slides here, and how you doing? 5 minutes, real quick slides here. There are studies out there. We know where a lot of these guys are. That's what adds to the frustration. In 1994, a RAND report, these are just kind of give you background. Linda, go skip. Did a report on the mission and the recovery. A little bit higher, please. And you'll see down, oops, okay. Look at number 17, unrecovered isolated burials of North Korean territory grouped by service. And you'll notice how many pages there are. You know, you have 20 pages of where they know where these guys are. And if you go on to the next one, please. Then we have this is going, okay, this is just a little bit more of an introduction of what you'll be seeing. And here is an example. So you have the reported remains in the left column, unrecovered, and then you have map coordinates of where they are. Notice the 27 unrecovered in one location. The next screen, please, you have 13. Never mind the ones and twos. And then here, look at the example, the 28 POWs. Look how specific it is. Semi-located, 1/2 mile, you know, you just have. They could just go walk there and say, this is my dad. And they probably know who those guys are too. Let's see. Now, then you have the Air Force. Is that what this is? Okay. So now the Air Force is those were ground troops. So next slide. So here you have the burial number. I don't know what that is about, but the number of remains, you have the latitude, longitude. A lot of times they know where these planes went in because they had a wingman, saw the plane go down, or the bombing run, they reported I'm on my target, and then they didn't come out. And you have very specific details, you know, the plane went in off of a bridge just north of the river, blah, blah, blah. And so we know, in fact, one of the things that we talked about in my 2016 visit was we wanted to be able to go out to these crash sites. This is a map from the Defense Prisoner of War Missing in Action Office. They cooperated with us wonderfully putting this online. The crash sites across North Korea, There are 600 crash sites involving 900 American servicemen. Next slide, please. And this is just one province. They have it broken down by province. So you can see that. In fact, I've talked to people, I don't know if there was anyone here who had missions when they were allowed to go back inside. And I said, hey, can you ask if a plane, if we knew that a plane went down in that area, can you ask if a plane went down? And they said, yeah. And the DPA arranged to put this publicly so that if they did bring that up, they wouldn't be accused of cooperating with DOD. No, it's online. Anybody can get it. Next, please. 1 minute. Oh my God. Next, please. More. I want to get the next slide. Can you click on the next? No, the next at the top. Next one over. I want to get to this. Yeah. So up a little bit higher, Okay, stop. Pyongyang, you see at the bottom. I've been wanting to use this. This was our approach. to Pyongyang, and this is where we believe my dad's plane is in this area, which is northeast, 10 miles northeast of Sunan, actually, which is where the airport is, just outside Pyongyang. So our quest now is to get the governments to talk, so that I thought what you said is the exact right thing, is if we can just talk, get normalization, whatever that might be involved, then we can work on other issues from the new denuclearization to the recovery of remains. There's so many. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. And of course, getting emotional is part of this work. And I'm really grateful to now introduce the next speaker, Yishin Bok, or Joy Gebhard. She has a wonderful story to share with us that many of you who have been with us through the last 2 days may have heard some parts of, and we're looking forward to hearing a longer period of speech. But I just want to say a few brief things before Joy starts. One is Joy is a graduate of the Women's Army College Nursing School and also of Busan University. And we're so grateful that you're here today, Joy. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Zibo. My name is Joy Lee Gebhard. My Korean name is Lee Bok-shin. As one of the refugees and Korean American separated families of the Korean War, I thank you for this opportunity to speak. In April 1950, it so happened that I had started to read Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, one of the 42 volumes at the Sariwon Library, where I spent the majority of my time when school was out. I was an avid reader, even though all of the books were in Japanese and Chinese characters, as there were no Korean books available because Japanese colonial government had forbidden learning Korean. I read Kant and Schopenhauer's The World as a Will and Representation. Of course, I did not understand much of the contents in view of the Chinese characters and words such as metaphysics. But I could not help my fascination and interest from the few parts I understood. I excelled in school, even receiving a special award from the education minister, Park Kon-young. I was selected to enter the Pyongyang Normal School as one of the 160 gifted students. My goal since age 11 was to become a doctor, discover a cure for cancer, and find a solution for world peace. I was certain that I would achieve these goals. I had a loving home, family, the best teachers, and their encouragement. I was so sure of my bright future that I was unshaken, undeterred, even as the machine gun bullets sprayed into my room, barely missing me on that fourth week of July, 1950. On June 29, I was in the city of Sariwon, located about 75 miles south from Pyongyang. I was 16 and expecting my mother to arrive for my graduation from Sariwon Middle School. But she was unable to attend because the train stations had been bombed. As many people started walking on foot to their own destinations, the road was full of people walking with bundles on their backs and heads. I too was packing a bag to take home with me when suddenly, with a terrible noise, bullets ripped through the mud wall of the Korean traditional house where I was, and smoke rose from the floor, the bullets barely missing me. I picked up the cartridges, still warm, on the floor, wrapped and packed them with the rest of my belongings. I still remember the machine gun bullets were made in 1942 in Japan, according to the writings on them. I left Sariwon for my home in Pyongyang, walking on foot for 3 nights and 4 days, sleeping with other travelers in an empty farmhouse or in the woods. We walked, sometimes in rain, and dried when the sun came out. I stopped at the roadside stream to tidy myself, washing my hands and face, when I came face to face with Kim, a student at Kim Il-sung University, working in the opposite direction to his home in Haeju, Ganghae-do. In past, Kim took the same train as I during the weekends visiting home. On the train, sitting in the same seats across from me, smiling, we used to exchange light conversation about schools. After spending the night in farmhouse, another night in the woods, I was wet and dry in the sun, my hair disarray. I was very embarrassed at being seen in the state that I was. 19-year-old Kim too looked disabled and in need of shaving. For a moment, wordless, we just stared at each other, but we knew we must get on the road and hurry homeward. Kim went south to Haeju, and I went north to Pyongyang. Kim, holding his college blazer on his shoulder, stared at me for a long time and said, "After the war, and 25 o'clock, let us meet here," pointing at the ground between a tree and the stream where both of us were standing. I in my school uniform, Kim in his college uniform. We departed, each going in our direction, merging into the crowd. I picked some apples from roadside orchard, started to eat when an old lady from nearby farmhouse came and offered me a boiled egg. It was timely, as I hadn't eaten since I left. After a day and a half of more working, I saw at a distance a familiar horizon, which told me I am getting closer to home. I decided to tidy myself and stopped by a stream again. I washed, changed my blouse, and combed my hair to make myself presentable to my father and mother, to reduce their shock at seeing my state. My face was so dark with sunburn, I could not even recognize myself when I glimpsed my face in my small pocket mirror. Finally, arriving home, upon entering the familiar gate, I bowed and said, "Father and Mother, I have returned. Here I bought some apples and souvenir." My father, who was ill with cancer and laying on the wooden porch, raised himself up, surprised, and said with a rare smile, "So you found your way home?" While home, I volunteered in a local temporary clinic in neighborhood. Neighbors injured by bomb fragments came to our home for care. All I had was alcohol and mercurochrome to wash their wounds. Within 3 weeks of my return, my father passed away at Kangso, where he went to rest. I helped at home with chores, but with the increased bombing, people were leaving the city of Pyongyang. My older sister took my younger siblings with a 1.5-year-old baby to a Buddhist temple in the mountain for refuge. Mr. Kim, a friend of our neighbor, had stayed at our house overnight with 3 other people. They had come looking for families. Mr. Kim told my mother the next day he would help me and send me to school and return when the war is over. Thinking I might be safer from the bombing, my mother allowed me to come to South Korea with Mr. Kim. Her last words to me were, "Soul is cold, keep warm, stay alive, and do right." On December 3, 1950, I came to Seoul. Within 3 months, Mr. Kim died. I didn't realize until I came to South Korea that I had lost everything. I was now a refugee and an orphan. I hadn't even graduated from high school and had no skill to earn a living. I had no shelter or food to sustain my life. And so I decided to enter back military nursing school in Busan. The impact of war was like a bomb that destroyed all I had hoped for. All of my life plans. I loved my family, my fatherland, and the world. I wanted to make a positive difference during this brief lifetime on Earth. Even then, I knew life was precious. I had no time to waste. In 1956, while I attending Busan University and working at the same time through the invitation and insistence of a Methodist minister from Texas, I came to the US to continue my studies. Never a day went by without thinking of my family. I wrote letters to the Red Cross, embassies in China, Poland, Soviet Union, asking for my help, to find my family. I wrote letters to my mother in Pyongyang when I was attending American University in Washington, but they returned. In 1988, after many years of my searching and waiting, out of the blue, I finally received a letter from DPRK, North Korea, from the Office of the Assistance for Korean Fellowmen Abroad, saying that they had located my family and I may visit them at any time at my convenience. I couldn't believe it. Not shocked. It wasn't even raining, but I put on my raincoat, went out for a walk in my neighborhood for blocks to digest the news. In May of 1988, I made my first visit back to Pyongyang to see my family after 38 years. I learned from my oldest sister that my mother had died within a month of my leaving, waiting each day for my return. I have made many visits to see my family until the new sanctions were imposed. My last visit to North Korea to see my family was in 2016. I have not heard from my family for 7 years. I feel I have lost my family again. With continued increasing sanctions, the trauma of this unending war continues. In spite of having lived and survived and succeeded in starting a new life and family in America, the stigma of being from North Korea provokes suspicion. I cope with these biases daily, compounding the personal trauma of war that is ever present with me. War destroys not only houses, buildings, railroad stations, and communities. War destroys hope and aspirations of the individual and all, replacing them with the horrors of war that after more than 70 years, time and memory amplify, not erase. Its legacy extends to my children and my grandchildren. I am close to 90. My time is limited. I have given my best to my adopted country, America, for 62 years as a citizen, a teacher, a nurse, business owner, a humanitarian, and taxpayer. But I have given so little to my own family, the source of my being here today. I cannot visit my own flesh and blood. I cannot visit the graves of my parents. I cannot even send a letter due to the sanction. As one of the oldest separated Korean American families, I ask my government to remove the sanctions, allowing separated families to reunite and end this ongoing war once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for sharing your testimony with us. It's an important reminder of how the trauma of the war continues with us. And I'm grateful now to introduce a colleague, Dr. Key Park, who's the Director of Korea Health Policy at Harvard Medical School. Since 2007, Dr. Park has visited the DPRK over 20 times, supporting medical cooperation with physicians and hospitals in the DPRK. And we're excited to listen to his story today.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can you all hear me? Okay. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. I just wanted to first say thanks to the Women DMZ, Christine Hahn, and also the Linda for hosting. Sorry. I'm just a bit stirred inside. I don't know if you are as well, from listening to Joy and Rick. Rick, I hope you find your dad's remains. And Joy, you get an award from me for world peace. I want to go back to the theme, human cost of unended war, and try to unpack that a little bit. And just, I'm not a historian, but I work in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and we look at social factors that impact health. If you look at warfare, history of warfare, a long time ago, Civil War, those fights, those battles actually happened in battlefields, right? And the soldiers got together, fought each other, and whoever won that battle. And civilians, by and large, were left out of casualties. That has changed significantly in the modern era. Today, over 90% of casualties from conflict is civilian. And that is because weapons have become increasingly sophisticated, right? We have weapons of mass destruction. We now, in battle plans and wars, routinely, literally destroy cities. And that has a lot to do with, I think, the way the North Koreans are thinking about how to defend themselves today. But I want to talk about a little bit on the human cost of war. Not only is there direct casualties, but there are actually secondary effects of war. Loss of medical systems, poverty, food shortages. But then there's other things like rising sexual violence, and then trauma and mental health. I can tell you, if you one thing that you can take away today is the intergenerational impact of war. Rick still has impact of it. I do too. My dad and mom were refugees. Went down to Busan, and to this day, they save everything. In Korean we say "ekya." We're not poor, but they can't throw anything away because you just never know. And my mom especially, she has 5 refrigerators. It's actually. I hope my mom's not watching. And you know what? I used to, but I no longer try to tell her we don't need all that food. But for her, it's a sense of security because she was insecure at one point. And so now we're dealing with intergenerational impact of war. And this is a human cost that we don't appreciate. Now, I'm really glad we're framing this as a human cost of unended war. It's not a lack of peace. War has not ended. When war breaks out, typically governments put martial law in place. You all know what martial law is, right? It's a replacement of civilian government with military government. And in that system, we give up fundamental civil rights, right? In the name of national security. Well, guess what? North Korea is still considered themselves as in war. And I think that really explains some of their, not all of it, but some of their motivation behind a highly securitized government and society. And you have to wonder, right? If we end the war, maybe some of that justification will go away, right? And maybe some of those liberties can be restored. But it also, the fact that there's no end of war creates a motivation for military readiness. And I will talk about it later on this afternoon with Anne. But I want to talk a little bit because North Korea that's military first, defense first. They have a 1.3 million active duty military. By per capita, so if the population of North Korea is about 25 million, that is highest in anywhere in the world, per capita. And then, of course, in terms of cost of maintaining an active military of that size is massive. 25% is some estimates in their national budget. One in every, or $4 or whatever North Korea uses goes to military. Now, that also motivates them to develop nuclear weapons. I think Professor Cumings really beautifully laid out the threat, the terror that they were living under. And they want to try to be, in order to defend themselves, they really felt that they had to develop nuclear weapons. Now, while they're maintaining military readiness, I will tell you our research team has analyzed their spending on health over the last 15 to 20 years. And to our estimates, they're spending between 6 to 7% of their GDP on health. And that has been sustained throughout the entire nuclear program and the ICBM program. For North Korea, the maintenance of health of their population is one of their top priorities. On top of that, they've, of course, maintained free education and free healthcare. I do have some data. We looked at the import of insulin from China. All right, insulin is a medication we use for diabetes. It actually has to be stored in refrigerators and it's perishable, so it doesn't last forever. And over the last couple of years, they have increased the import of insulin by tenfold. And you can see this on Chinese import-export data. Our analysis shows that that amount of insulin is sufficient to treat about 70% of North Korea's diabetic patients. So when you hear some people say North Korea doesn't care about their people, or they have abandoned the welfare of their people for prioritizing military, it simply is not true. North Korea's elite is what, 10% of their population? So they're buying insulin to treat, and these are chronic diseases. These are not just drugs you give out, you have to maintain them for up to almost 70% of their population. Now let's talk a little bit about the ongoing, the fact that there's an unended war, and we have there are coercive measures, right? Hostile policies. So in the absence of actual, bullets going across, there are other things that countries that are at war do. And these are, I think someone mentioned sanctions. And then Professor Cumings is right. North Korea is subjected to probably the harshest sanctions regime in history. Think about sanctions as warfare without bullets. Think about, and so what's happened in North Korea, the sanctions have been gradually ramped up from bullets to small bombs, to artillery, to missiles. And then they've been upped in the last 6 or 7 years to now what we call sectoral sanctions. That's the nuclear bomb of sanctions. Why is that? Because it involves civilian economy. It is indiscriminate in military versus civilian targets. So these sectoral sanctions are designed to block all of North Korea's exports, garments, minerals, and seafood. And it limited import of petroleum products to 10% of their previous years. It's a complete economic blockade. And these sanctions disingenuously say that these are not intended to harm ordinary people of North Korea. It is simply disingenuous and just an outright lie. Same way the nuclear weapon cannot distinguish between civilians and military targets, the sectoral sanctions are going to have intended impact on the civilian of North Korea. A few years ago, Korea Peace Now, Christine An assembled a number of experts to come up with a report, Human Cost of Sanctions on North Korea. It was a gendered, especially for looking at the women aspects of it. But one of our contributions was that we looked at the impact of sanctions on the UN agency's ability to deliver humanitarian programming inside North Korea. Things like emergency maternal kits that are used in case of a complication that occurs during childbirth. These are known to reduce maternal mortality. Those kits were delayed or undelivered in part. And then the ability to treat severe acute malnutrition in children under 5, which has a high mortality rate. And UNICEF was not able to fulfill all of its programming due to delays and funding cuts due to sanctions. So we estimated this is a rock bottom number, very conservative estimate, of almost 4,000 North Koreans may have died as a result of these sanctions. Sanctions kill. We know it, and we should not accept that. On top of these sanctions, we have actually gone beyond and applied pressure tactics and actively prevented certain kinds of humanitarian actions. So one example is the Global Fund. They provided for over the last 10 years, 100,000 drugs for tuberculosis for 100,000 North Koreans. They do that for most of the countries with high burden TB. In 2018, they stopped that program, and it's come out and that US and Japan were the ones that forced Global Fund to stop it. They have resumed their programming, but you can see what's happening. There's currently no banking channel for NGOs or even international organizations to pay for their expenses in Pyongyang. And Jennifer's group she can maybe talk more about that. Now, US actually has unilateral sanctions and US Treasury regulations. And I won't name who, but a US faith-based NGO, long history of working in North Korea, was actually investigated, and they had to get lawyers. So you see where things are going. We have allowed our leaders and our examples of our morals to deteriorate, and we have become barbarians because we accept death of children and women as acceptable in name of national and regional security. Now, I'm a medical doctor. I don't know if you know that. And I take an oath of ethics when I graduated from medical school before getting into actual practice. It says it's a Hippocratic oath, and there's a part called primum non nocere. It means first do no harm, because we're given skills and medicines and other treatments that can actually harm people. We have that oath, and we try to not harm anyone. Why isn't there a similar oath for people who use weapons, who are capable of delivering sanctions, who are deadly? The benefits of ending the war is clear. For a health practitioner like myself, peace is a prerequisite for health. It's the most important thing we can do before even providing medical care. We have a solution. Peace is attainable, and we can and should make it happen. And what I think what I'm seeing over the last 15 years is the increasing effectiveness and influence by Korean Americans. And I'm going to speak specifically to Gyopos, okay? We have a role to play, and we've been doing an amazing job. We need to do more, and we need to act as the bridge, right, between our community to the general American public. They need to understand what we're doing is immoral. Now, some may say that it's hard to take on the military-industrial complex. Absolutely, absolutely. We're small fry compared to what they're capable of. But you know what? I'm going to finish with a quote from Martin Luther King. He said, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Thank you.
Thank you, Key, for that inspiring ending to the panelist remarks. And I just should say that, yes, the OFAC investigation was American Friends Service Committee. And just to use my moderator's privilege, I'll say that I work with the American Friends Service Committee, and we also deliver humanitarian programming in DPRK, working with partners since 1980. And Key, I just could not agree more with just about everything you said, especially around sanctions. So I think we have about 10 minutes left, trying to keep to our schedule, and we'll take some questions, maybe 2 or 3.
Hi, my name is Paul Lee from Divided Families USA. I think all three of you, Joy, Rick, Key, you mentioned the intergenerational effect of the Korean War. And yesterday afternoon, many of us participated in this communal grief event and circle on Han. And the person leading the circle was talking about how oftentimes our children, we don't know how to cry. We are not taught how to cry or taught why we cry. So I guess my question is, how to educate the next generation who have not had these lived experiences or relationships with these family members or people in North Korea. And AFSC is supporting a project that my organization is doing, an oral history of video messages from Korean American divided families, including Joy, the family members in North Korea. And the goal is to try to educate the next generation and other Americans. So I guess my question is, what advice would you have of teaching the next generation about how to deal with this Han and how to process this Han and grief?
For me?
Maybe if you would like it to be.
No, you go.
Well, I'll address that, Paul, in the sense that, I mean, I cry so easily, but I have the wound. So how do you get people who don't have the wound to feel the emotion? And I might, off the top of my head, say that they have to look to the people who were hurt the most, who they love, and try to bring that into their own life. But I don't know if you can do that. You cannot replicate the pain and the void that is there that causes us to cry. So and if that's where you were going, to extend the emotion, because that is a concern, because how does that, if that fades, then does the caring phase? So how do we perpetuate that attachment to it, that emotional attachment? It's a very good question. And I don't know, the doctor may have a biological approach that works. Anatomical, I don't know.
So in lead up to today, I was contacted by two 30 under 30. Is Iris here?
She's
Iris?
working on an article.
Oh.
She's hard at work.
So I get an email and say, hey, I want to do an article about this panel. Maybe she reached out to you as well. And she's like, has connections to NBC, I think and so it was actually published. And she's this young Korean American, right? And she took it upon herself to make this issue personal. Then I got contacted by another gentleman named Kale, and Kale's here. And Kale's, I found out, is not even Korean. And this is, I'm so hopeful because the next generation of leaders who I think see the value of what we're doing. And it's what we're dealing with is universal values of family, love, peace. These aren't, this transcends cultures and language and countries. And I'm just really hopeful that the next generation can really make a difference, tell the stories, help tell the stories, but they're getting a lot more sophisticated than I think we were when we were their age, for sure. I wasn't even thinking about writing, these beautiful pieces. But thank you for the younger generation for doing that.
I'd like to add, if I could. Yes, a big applause, because I wonder if your question, Paul, is necessary. Look at what's happening without that emotional attachment. If I'm still on your track, it's wonderful to see this go on. And maybe it's not necessary that they cry, that you cry, but because there's something driving it, as you can see around this room and all the people that have been working on this, that is just impressive without that emotional attachment.
For me, it's more like a comment more than a questions. And I thank you for evoking 선생님. And I'm also Deibert member. And 2 times I cry really when I speak. It's about the Deibert family and LGBTQ issue. So because it's all personal to me, so I think it's really important that people with a personal, I guess personal feeling go out like speak to younger generation, inspire them, and then they can work on behalf of us, and then we support them. And also, I just want to have a short tell you the short experience of my grandmother. My grandmother is opposite. So my grandmother came here when she was 65 from South Korea because she knew she couldn't meet her older son in North Korea. And she came and she worked in the factory, and through my father also did finding the divided family members. So he found my uncle. And at the age of like 70, she was lucky enough to go and see her own son after 37 years. And it was, so for me, it's, it's the opposite story of 복신 선생님, right? And I saw that, and then it just, amazing. And then that was possible then, right? Now people cannot do that. People like my grandmother cannot go. So we just like ask, I guess, everybody, to lift a ban, travel ban, so we can meet the family members. I can meet my cousins. And really, thank you for doing this.
Thank you. And I see that we are out of time. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, one more question. Maybe I see 3 hands up, but maybe Kale in the front. Okay, yeah.
Maybe it's a comment more than a question. It's responding to the first question is, those generations who have not had a direct trauma, how can we cry? And what I'm discovering as I get older is that actually there's a transgenerational trauma, that collected trauma moves from one generation to the other. And I'm beginning to discover that is my pain. There are certain human situations where I have no reason why I'm so sad, so depressed, and so angry, so uncontrollable tears and all those things. I mean, when you grew up with parents who were war refugees, my father grew up in North Korea, but by the time it was divided, they already all moved to South Korea. But rarely talked about their war experiences. It took a long time for them to even open up. And when you grow up with family setting like that, it affects you. But that's not my own story. I discovered that story of every Koreans and Korean Americans of my generation. And there are other traumas that are, God, there's one specific thing I was going to talk, but I forgot. I guess I'm getting old. Oh, didn't sleep much for these conferences. So just want to say that there are pains that are transferred, and we have to address those things as well. In other words, not being able to fully thrive as, one example is when they find out that I'm Korean American, they was from South or North. I said, I'm not South Korean American or North Korean American, I'm Korean American.
Yeah.
And to deal with that, continuously fighting for my identity, it's very painful, right? And I guess people feel that. Just let's recognize the collective trauma that Koreans experienced, and Americans and 19 other nations that send soldiers to Korean War on both sides, right? And the trauma that's continuing. That's literally all over the world, reflected continuously in global foreign policies and continuous war. It's human, entire global trauma, and we're localizing into Korean-American conflict. We have to do this to heal together.
I think we're going to end now, but just to say, as I said at the start, we could spend all day talking about the impacts of the unended war. And I know that there's conversations happening after this and in our communities and in our families. And I hope that we can continue the healing process and end the war.
Please join me in thanking Jennifer and her incredible panelists for a very moving experience for all of us. I'd like to welcome you all to take some lunch. We will have for those of you online, we will have a break now and reconvene. What time? At 1 o'clock. So please come back, enjoy your lunches and spend lots of time with each other discussing what you've learned. Thank you. So we can. Well, earlier we had a very emotional session looking at the humanitarian, the human costs of this ongoing tragic situation on the Korean Peninsula. Now we need to turn ourselves to some very meaty issues and on a discussion among the kinds of policies that are keeping us from resolving those human issues. I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator, Professor Jiyeon at Northwestern University. She will be introducing the panelists for the second session. And let me turn the mic over to Professor Ye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really thankful for all of you here today, interested and active in Korea peace issues, and to GWU and VR for their partnership with Women Across DMZ. You know, as you know, tensions between North Korea and South Korea and between North Korea and the United States they're larger and more intense than really at any other time that I can remember. And I've lived longer than I want to admit to. A couple things, two things that I think are really, really important for us to remember, even though we already all know it. One is that North Korea is now a major nuclear power and has said explicitly that it reserves the right to first strike. Right? That is really huge. And as renowned historian, Professor Bruce Cumings said earlier today, that represents a catastrophic failure of US policy. The other thing is that South Korea has long held nuclear ambitions. Many of you will know that Park Chung-hee in the 1970s wanted to and made some efforts at developing nuclear weapons, and it was deterred by the United States, which said, oh, no, we will protect you and we will provide all of these other things. So there was more military stuff, more economic aid, heightened nuclear umbrella, and Park Chung-hee said, okay, right? But now, under the new administration, this interest in nuclear capabilities has been rising again. And it's not just from, you know, one dictator who thinks that it's important or his advisors who think it's important. There's actually, from what I can tell, some interest among the more conservative right-wing South Koreans, right? And their logic is, North Korea has it, why shouldn't we, right? And so there's a debate, right? Like, do we need that? Can we trust our own government with nuclear weapons? Can we trust the United States with nuclear weapons? Can we trust the US to keep protecting them? All of this, again, represents, as Professor Cumings said this morning, a catastrophic failure. And so I'm really, really pleased to introduce our three speakers who are going to talk with us about what is the state of nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula, and what are the prospects for not going to not having a nuclear war? And what are the dangers, the risks of having a nuclear war? So our first speaker is here via Zoom, and he is Siegfried Hecker, who is the former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory and professor emeritus at Stanford University. He is currently professor of practice at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey and professor of practice in the Department of Nuclear Engineering at Texas A&M University. He has been at the Los Alamos National Laboratory for 34 years, including serving as its 5th director from 1986 through 1997. He was at Stanford for 17 years in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering, and in the Center for International Security and Cooperation. For the Center for International Security and Cooperation, he served as the co-director from 2007 to 2012. And he has worked on nuclear matters and nuclear issues for most of his career, including having visited all countries with declared nuclear weapons programs, including North Korea. He is the editor of Doomed to Cooperate, 2 volumes documenting the history of Russian-US laboratory-to-laboratory cooperation, and Hinge Points, an inside look at North Korea's nuclear program, written with Elliott. Our second speaker is Dan Leaf, who is a retired U.S. Air Force general and the former acting commander of the Pacific Command. He has been working on Korea peace issues as an independent organizer, independent activist since the mid-2010s, and we're very pleased to have him here today. Our third speaker is Ann Wright, who is a retired U.S. military Army colonel who became a distinguished diplomat. She received the State Department Award for Heroism in 1997 after helping evacuate several thousand people during the Civil War in Sierra Leone. She is most noted for having been one of 3 State Department officials to publicly resign in direct protest of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. As a peace activist, she has collaborated with Code Pink and is currently active with Veterans for Peace and also with Women Cross DMZ. She is one of the original women activists who went on the historic 2015 trip to North Korea, which has been memorialized in an amazing documentary titled Crossings. So I want to start off this session by asking our 3 speakers to just quickly tell us one important main point that they want all of us to take away from our session this afternoon. And we will begin with Professor Hecker.
Thank you very much, Professor Yao. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I'm not able to be there with you myself, and I missed Professor Cumings' talk this morning. So indeed, I was asked to be very, very brief. I must say on North Korea, that's just about an impossibility. But let me just then try to summarize it all, is that for 3 decades, we've had an opportunity to constrain North Korea's nuclear weapons program, and we failed. That is the US government. Of course, North Korea didn't make it easy. However, as we now examine the happenings of the last few years, that whereas for those 3 decades, we had an opportunity because North Korea was seriously interested in normalization with the United States, that has now dramatically changed. And in my opinion, North Korea has gone back to aligning itself with Russia and with China. And that represents us with a very, very different world. And we need to understand what's gone wrong in the past in order to be able to deal with North Korea the way it is now. I hope that was brief enough.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hecker. And next, Dan Leaf.
Thank you. And aloha. I have to start with that. It's an honor to participate in this forum and with the distinguished speakers and audience. I'm a little bit of an outlier with you. I am a fighter pilot. That's what I identify as, and so that may bother some of you, and guess what? I don't care. Okay. But that is my perspective looking at the risk of nuclear war with North Korea. I was engaged in the nuclear enterprise in my 3-year career at several junctures. I knew no nuclear weapons. I know war because I've been there. I know how they start. And if I could leave any one thought with you, you may have seen me write it before or heard it from my lips before, but I have to say again, we are one bad decision away from a nuclear exchange with North Korea, and it could happen. And it can't be dismissed with the supposed rationality of either side, because irrational events, misunderstandings, misperceptions, miscommunication, or in this case, the complete lack of communication, can feed irrational actions. The way to start down a road that leads to whatever you might think is a good outcome with regard to North Korea is with a narrowly focused effort, sustained and serious on the part of the United States government to reach a peace treaty and the state of war. We are getting nowhere in this paradigm, and that's the way to shift the paradigm where we might get somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for Ann Wright.
Well, I'll just echo what Dan said. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to all the organizers. Always hearing Dr. Cumings speak is something. And then Siegfried Hecker, Dr. Hecker, holy smoke. I mean, he's been everywhere. He's been into nuclear facilities before. And your book, Hinge Points, is really good. We all ought to read that because it gives the points that we the US could have moved forward, and it gives some points where the North Koreans, but it's, in my opinion of reading his book, it's that it's been the US government that has kind of undercut the opportunities that we've had. We really appreciate Dan being here. I mean, for years, I was about the highest ranking military person we had on these panels, and now I've been usurped by by the general. And while we don't agree on all aspects of militarization of the Pacific and all this stuff, but the thing that we do agree with is that it's a dangerous world out there, and it could erupt in any moment in something that we just would be horrified. You know, next week is August 6th and 9th, the commemoration of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, something we don't want to ever see in the world again. And the point, I think, of our panel is whatever we can do as citizens to encourage our congressional delegations. And we and the 30 under delegation that we've had here have been to probably 50 offices in the US Congress in this last couple of days, saying we need some sort of agreement that will lessen the tensions so that both parties, both countries, well, 3 countries, let's not forget South Korea, that the 3 countries involved in this can start talking about it. And I'll just end by saying, while we are here in the national mobilization to end the Korean War, our mobilization here in Washington, D.C., wait till you see the pictures of what's going on in South Korea right now. I mean, they've had conferences, they've had vigils on the streets of Seoul. They have people, you probably won't like this. They have people at the military bases, US military bases of all the military, well, not all of them, but most of them, with signs saying we need to end the Korean War. So, and they also say troops out. That's what he's probably not going to go along with, but oh, okay.
Probably not.
But the bottom line is we're having wonderful opportunities to educate our fellow citizens, both here in the United States and in South Korea, on the need to end the war now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, you know, it's interesting to me to hear Dr. Hecker saying that the North has been pursuing 2 tracks: normalization of the United States and nuclear weapons, because usually that first track is not mentioned at all. And I'm wondering, Siegfried, if you would like to elaborate a little bit on what are the signs? How do we know really that North Korea has been pursuing normalization with the United States?
Well, thank you very much. I tried to describe in the book in Hinge Points exactly, how it started and then essentially how it evolved. And so just again, to be very brief, at least the best that my colleagues and I can put it together is around 1990. We had what some people call a pattern change in North Korea's leadership. And that's when Kim Il-sung decided, and that was near the end of the Cold War, as China was looking to make economic connections with South Korea. Russia, of course, it was the Soviet Union, it was falling apart. And that's when Kim Il-sung decided that perhaps it is much better for Korea, his Korea, to go ahead and reach out and to seek normalization with the United States. And of course, the most immediate example of what happened is what led to the agreed framework. By the time the document was signed in October 1994, Kim Il-sung had died and his son took over. However, he continued that policy, and even though it was a pretty rocky time anyway, during the agreed framework, by the end of 2000, the end of the Clinton administration, both the Americans and the North Koreans thought they were really, really close. But then when the Bush administration came in, they shattered the agreed framework, in the words of John Bolton. And then I go ahead and explain to where Kim Jong-il several times also tried to seriously reach across the United States. One of those times was the so-called September 19th, 2005 agreement. I should say I was first in North Korea in 2004. I went back again every year for 7 years in a row. I met their nuclear people, I met their diplomats, I visited the nuclear facilities. And so I had some sense of sort of the empathy that is trying to understand, not sympathize, but empathize with North Korea's views. And in that agreement, the North Koreans reached across, and actually the Chinese, helped to bring it about. But the Americans, again, did things to walk away, and I explain that in the book. Kim Jong-un also reached across with the Leap Day deal as he had just taken over. And again, I describe what actually happened and then why the United States. Now note, we have first the Bush administration. By this time, we're talking about the Obama administration. And then we get to the Trump administration, by which time North Korea had already done, even more nuclear tests. And of course, by 2017, they did the 6th nuclear test. And so whereas Trump reached across because Kim Jong-un was interested in this normalization and dialogue with Singapore, then it all fell apart with Hanoi. So I think there's enough indications in there that the North Koreans at times, all three Kims, had a serious interest in trying to reach normalization through dialogue with the United States. However, because they were never sure it's really going to work, they concurrently, and that's the dual track part, also developed nuclear weapons. And so that's sort of the tragedy of the last 20 years. Thank you.
So much for that explanation. That's really amazing. If I could follow up with another question for you, Siegfried. Thinking about the 1980s, when we had so much going on in the way of disarmament, arms treaties, scaling back, awareness of the threat of nuclear arms. And then we shift to the 1990s and you have nuclear nonproliferation issues and signatories to that treaty and all of that. And so we're left with what you call a global nuclear order, right? North Korea is the only signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that actually ended up developing nuclear weapons. Since that treaty, 4 other countries have also developed nuclear weapons, but if I remember correctly, they were not signatories. And so I'm wondering, how can we place, what's the position or place of North Korea's development of nuclear weapons within this bigger global framework?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. And I must confess, I've been thinking particularly hard about this during the last couple of weeks with the movie Oppenheimer. Bringing attention back to the nuclear issues and the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of actually finding some ways to cooperate globally. And in essence, the global nuclear order, by what I mean by that, there are a lot of countries that don't believe there's a global nuclear order. What I mean by global nuclear order is since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's been no military use of a nuclear device, a nuclear weapon. That's quite amazing. There also, even though Oppenheimer and actually John F. Kennedy, the president much later, thought there were going to be dozens of countries that develop nuclear weapons, we have less than 10 countries that actually have developed nuclear weapons. That's also not a bad result from the global nuclear order. Third is we've had no nuclear terrorism, which is totally just incredibly remarkable and surprising. But it's because the countries like the Soviet Union, then Russia, China, United States work together. And fourth, we've been able to take advantage of nuclear energy. So we've done all of those things. And so as we look now, North Korea challenges, of course, that global nuclear order. It's very different. It falls in a very different category than India and Pakistan because they developed the nuclear weapons because of the other. In North Korea's case, we did have a chance to have it go in a different direction. It isn't there, but now it's there, and it's so much more complicated because it's really the issue of South Korea and the United States. And so, I looked in great detail as to where does North Korea really fit in, and it's going to be, a very, very difficult journey to get to denuclearization now.
Thank you for that. So, I'm really struck also by Dan Leaf's comment about we're just one bad decision away from nuclear war, and Anne's observation that really now more than ever, ordinary citizens, activists are concerned about peace on the Korea Peninsula and what the ongoing military standoff in Korea, what that means, not only for Korea, but for everybody else, right? And so I had a question about, about that. So we've had a long kind of public discourse and a long sort of international relations policy discourse around how, well, the real threat now vis-a-vis nuclear weapons is some rogue entity, whether a rogue nation like North Korea or Iran, I'm putting rogue nation in quotes, or some rogue private entity like a terrorist organization gets its hands on nuclear weapons, and that's where the current threat really lies. And you're saying something completely different. I'm wondering if you could talk about that, right? Like, why are people thinking that the real threat is from rogue nations and rogue entities and not from this US-North Korea relationship itself?
Because they don't know what they're talking about? No, I shouldn't be so glib because this is a very serious matter. Before I answer, I have to kind of highlight the friendship that Anne and I have formed over the last week because we are different. We didn't know each other before. We had email contact, but we come at this differently. We have different views on many issues, but converge on the need for a peace treaty. And as we look at this room and hear sometimes cheering and sometimes jeering in other rooms or other sides of the triangle yesterday, we would have heard cheers and jeers in the opposite direction. I think it's really important to expand the dialogue with those who don't think like you in a respectful, positive way. I'm stating the obvious to say there isn't enough of that, but find a neighbor who views it differently and have a conversation. Until I found Christine on there in Honolulu, I was kind of the Lone Ranger just shouting into the heavens. And so now I have a bigger voice, but even the small voices matter and they have to be done in a positive way. So why don't folks get the immediacy of this threat? It isn't just my own personal hubris of being convinced I'm right. I have been in every element of nuclear operations, and I've been to war, and I thought a lot about how they start, and I try to visualize it. So let's look at one case you didn't mention. Russia, Ukraine expanding to a nuclear circumstance. Could that happen? Absolutely. How many bad decisions would it take to get there? Quite a few. Over a period of time. Quite a few. China, Taiwan, China-US competition. Could that get nuclear? Absolutely. Over time. Numerous bad decisions, miscommunications. I'm not for that either. That's to be addressed later. But why is North Korea so different? Well, it's the compactness of the scenario right there in Pyongyang or wherever Kim Jong-un has access to his launch methodology, and the finite relatively nature of the conflict, this war that's quite focused on the South Korea, the US, and North Korea. And all it takes is a misunderstanding. Let me give you a tactical example of a misunderstanding that illustrates how you can get from rational to irrational very quickly and convince yourself that you're seeing something you're not. Back in the 80s, US F-14 Tomcats shot down two Libyan MiG-23s flying out of Tripoli. They were defending our carrier. And if you watch the tape that you can find on the internet, it's so compelling and dramatic. The backseater says, he's turned back into us for the fourth time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they build this scenario of what's happening in their heads and shoot down the two MiGs. What they described was not happening. The lead pilot and the lead MiG-21 was flying a standard instrument departure, looking at his kneeboard, trying to pass his annual check ride. Okay. That happens in the fog of war at that finite level. So imagine Kim Jong-un trying to launch one of these illegal against UNSCR tests, but carefully planning it for a high trajectory and no overflight over Japan. But because rocket science is really tough, I know that. I was the vice commander at Air Force Space Command. It doesn't do that. And it's a lower trajectory and appears to be threatening an overflight. And on this side, we decide it is and engage it with a ground-based interceptor. What's Kim's response to that? I mean, he could be wholly rational, as some surmise, to that point. What's his response? And if he responds with a nuclear weapon, how do we respond? Okay, this could absolutely happen tomorrow, actually today. So we have tried many other things. We have a similar view about the submarine deployment and some of the bellicosity of recent responses. But I mean, there is a bit of a conundrum. What's the one unequivocal thing that could break this chain? And that is a legitimate, aggressive, persistent pursuit of a peace treaty, in my view.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. You know, I think that it's really common to think that if things get to war and nuclear war between North Korea and the United States, it would be a rational, quote unquote, policy decision. And what Dan Leaf is letting us know and really emphasizing is that it's not. It's just a mistake, some kind of miscommunication, a mistake. Right? And that in a lot of ways, for me, I think is just way more terrifying than the idea of a rational policy decision. And so your point that an aggressive pursuit of peace is the antidote, I want to ask Anne, what really is, we haven't had that for 70 years, right? Longer, actually, if you count from 1945. And we've had peace movements before. We've had citizen groups and peace groups imploring Congress and imploring policymakers before. What, if anything, is different about this moment and this movement now?
Well, I'm not too sure there's anything different at the moment. We go in these ups and downs and ups and downs, and there are, people that are out on the streets as we were last night and as they were in Seoul. And we keep railing against our governments, saying we really need these agreements, and we keep getting stonewalled by our governments. And tragically, I mean, I don't think we're in a different situation right now. We continue to get stonewalled, although we do make some efforts. Like we've been in Congress. We have a House resolution that now has what, 36 signatures saying there needs to be peace. In the last session of Congress, we had 50 people that had signed the House resolution. So we need to work more as we go back to our groups to work more on that. But I think the main thing is that we can't give up, that we have to keep going, we have to keep going, we have to keep going. And we have to take warnings like we're getting from Dr. Hecker, from General Leaf, from Dr. Cumings, that this is a really, really dangerous moment in our history. And it's for those of us that are really concerned about it. And it's not tragically, I don't think it's not the majority of the US citizenry, but it's up to us to keep educating people on it. So we just have to keep after it. And there are some very specific things that we've been talking about of, trying to get the travel ban lifted, trying to get that lifted so that we can take people into North Korea and let them meet some North Korean people. How many of you all have ever been to North Korea? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And everybody was on the Women Cross DMZ. How about stand up? There we go. One. There, Medea's waving in the background. Christine over here. Young. Okay. Well, it's important, these cultural moments that we have when we actually get to meet, the enemy. It's not Joy's enemy. I mean, it's a family. How many of you all have family members that are in North Korea now? And who doesn't even know? I mean, how many just don't even have a clue? Yeah. Well, all of this to say that it is the impetus for us to try to get cultural exchanges going, to try to do the human thing of getting to know people, and maybe even trying to take a congressional delegation. I mean, they're going to be scared to death for sure. I mean, I was too. And Christine said in 2015 early, would you like to go to North Korea? And it was like, hell no. Geez, are you kidding? I mean, it was scary. And she convinced me to go. And, it's a life-changing experience, as anyone who's been to North Korea knows. So it's up to us to push for these opportunities to get to know people, to get to be able to tell our community that there's no way in the world that we would ever want a nuclear attack or a non-nuclear attack on North Korea, that we stand for having peaceful relations with countries. Thank you.
Senator Leaf, I think you had some comments.
Yeah, I wanted to pile on and things to be done with the to-do list. And I mentioned this at the press conference. But one thing, one of the many reasons we don't have a peace treaty is it has never been anybody's job in the United States government. When I advocate for this, folks in government, in the military, in Congress will say, well, how would you do that? For example, the legal transition from armistice to peace treaty. I don't know. You're the government. You tell me. We need an office, an organization responsible for Korean War resolution, period. Not for the diplomacy and or sanctions or negotiations or deterrence, or figure out how, once the moment presents itself, we actually make peace, how we reconsider boundaries, how we establish liaisons in a practical, technical sense. If we're not doing that serious work of peace, we're not serious about peace.
Thank you so much for that comment. I have a question for Dr. Hecker here. And that is, given what you know and your experience with North Korea policymakers, the government, its nuclear program, what kind of influence do you think that really substantive movements toward a peace agreement with the United States would have on that nuclear program?
So over the the last 20 years, I think it's had rather little impact. And I say that just based on my own experience. Since I went to North Korea first in 2004, and then, as I said, for altogether 7 years in a row, even though I was never in the US government, even at Los Alamos, many people don't know, I was an employee of the University of California, which actually Robert Oppenheimer was also. He didn't want to wear a uniform at the time, as the movie shows. But I was an employee of the government, but I stayed very close to the government. So during this whole time, from 2004 to now, on the issues of North Korea, I've done the same for the other countries, from Russia to China, et cetera. And so I would come back, from North Korea, having learned a lot in terms of not just what's in their nuclear facilities and how they think about nuclear weapons, but what sort of relationship they want with the United States. I took those back. And as I mentioned, whether it was the Bush administration, the Obama administration, or the Trump administration, I would say I had very little impact all the way around. And so it was frustrating for me to get through on these issues where the government was interested, in what's going on in the nuclear arena. So to then try to take that over and say in the peace treaty, I think those people who've been trying to push and saying, look, a peace treaty is one of those steps you need to take because you have to listen to the North Koreans also. What do they want? What do they fear? And so if the peace treaty is an important step, then one needs to go in that direction. However, again, it's had, I think, very little impact in the government. In the Biden administration, my view is they actually have some people who are very knowledgeable about North Korea. For example, Ambassador Sung Kim, he knows North Korea. He's been there in North Korea. Unfortunately, he's doing his job only part-time because there's not much action in North Korea. But President Biden himself was actually there when I gave my testimony when I returned in 2004 from North Korea, where they actually convinced me that they have the bomb. And it's in that visit that they actually allowed me to hold the plutonium in my hand, I should say, in a glass jar, sealed. And President Biden was there at the hearing. And then he spent an extra hour with me afterwards. And so he knows a lot about North Korea. And actually, Secretary Blinken was there as Senator Biden's staffer at the time. So we have people in the government that understand a lot of these things, but somehow we're not able to get North Korea, up on the screen. And I very much share the frustration of General Leaf by saying, how can we not? This is indeed a very dangerous situation. And the way that I like to put it, so if you look at the nuclear world, there are only 3 countries that can threaten the United States and its assets with a nuclear weapon. Of course, there's Russia today, and we worry about them, of course, now particularly. There's China. I'm not so much worried about China, but nevertheless, they're building up their capability. So those are the 2 big guys. Which country is the 3rd? North Korea. For heaven's sakes, how can we not put North Korea up in the priority screen and then discuss everything, from the peace treaty as to how do we reduce the risks that we actually face with North Korea's having and continuing developing ever more capable nuclear weapons capabilities. So very, very frustrating.
Thank you for that. So this question I'd like to open up to all three of our panelists, and that is, what are the possibilities for nuclear disarmament? There was a time when in the 1980s rather, when nuclear disarmament was actually a goal. There were treaties or treaty talks at least toward that end. And but now that doesn't seem to really be on anybody's radar. And everybody, at least in the United States, is really thinking about North Korea. How can we get North Korea to disarm, give up its nuclear weapons? So this is kind of a two-part question. One is, what's the actual possibility for North Korea to give up what it now already has, nuclear capability? And two, more broadly, what are the possibilities for nuclear disarmament globally? I wonder if we could start with
I'll do that.
Colonel Wright.
Zero on both fronts, tragically. I don't think the US government, let's start with our own government. I don't think the US government is at all interested, and they won't even sign the, what was that last one? TPMZ, what, they won't even sign that thing, you know? And why should North Korea give up anything? I mean, when they've got threats of us on their border, that's their ace in the hole, so to speak. So at this moment, I don't think there's any possibility, as much as I hate to say it, but realistically, it ain't there.
I'm too much of an inherent optimist to say zero. So whatever is the next number above zero, that's it. With regard to North Korea, the odds of denuclearization are zero absent a peace treaty. But for a fundamental shift in the paradigm, it ain't happening. And who can blame them? Would you? Come on, man. And that's why starting with denuclearization is such a losing strategy. I think it still needs to remain a priority, a long-term goal, a stated demand. But and that for the broader question of denuclearization of the rest of the world, of global nuclear disarmament, highly unlikely. But since we're going in the wrong direction, if we don't reverse that trend and start down in numbers of countries and start down in numbers of weapons, then they will be zero. I do think it starts with how we engage with North Korea. I think that it's also extremely important in that regard as a, I don't know, pace setter for the approach to nuclear weapons in the modern world. We have to look at that as a reason to engage thoughtfully and responsibly and understand their position, start with peace, and then work to a better place.
Thank you. Dr. Siegfried Hecker? So,
Thank you. So let me first start with nuclear weapons in North Korea. So I gave a lecture at Yonsei University 2017 where I asked the question, will Kim Jong-un give up nuclear weapons? And my answer is I don't know. But I added, and I don't think he knows either, because it depends. It depends on so many things, just like those things that are being discussed here. The issue of a peace treaty, or how do we take what they're concerned about, their hopes, their fears, into our policy decisions. And so we had various chances. In 2000, and when we went over to Bush administration, 2001, they didn't have nuclear weapons. And so the Clinton administration actually in the agreed framework kept them away from nuclear weapons. Of course, there were other complications, and I explained those in great detail in my book. I mean, the North Koreans didn't exactly cooperate, but they didn't develop nuclear weapons. Under Bush, they did. Under Obama, they built more, and under Trump, they built more yet. So it's become much more difficult today to envision North Korea, and just like General Leaf just said, to start with denuclearization. That's why we're not going anywhere. That's just a non-starter. I also firmly believe that the end goal has to be a Korean peninsula without nuclear weapons. So that's where we want to go. We now have a very difficult job to get there. As far as global disarmament, I just participated in a Monterey Institute a session on the TPNW, and that is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And quite frankly, I am at this point not in favor of that treaty. So my view there again is the long term, the answer does have to be zero nuclear weapons. And again, as General Leaf just sort of indicated, if it's not zero, what is it? Is it 1? Is it 5? Is it 10? And then the even more difficult question is who gets to keep them? Should it just be the United States, Russia, the P5, or who gets to keep them? So the end goal, again, also has to be, the elimination of nuclear weapons. But to get there right now, the treaty is not the way to get there, because what's critical now, and at least what drives me, is not the elimination of nuclear weapons, but to make sure that there never again is use of a nuclear weapon. And that means both from a standpoint of between countries or from a terrorist. That requires cooperation, and it requires the sort of cooperation that right now we don't have in the world. But it really behooves the United States to continue to try to push the world in that direction. But right now is not a good time in the nuclear world. That's my view.
Thank you so much for your comments, all three panelists. I have one final question, and then I'm going to turn this over to all of you for questions for the panelists. And my final question is, what actually are the prospects? Like how, for example, how would you, if you had your druthers and had the authority, go about pursuing a peace agreement with North Korea?
I'd establish the special director for Korean War resolution under the National Security Council. I'd ask Congress to make it a legislative priority, because part of the unraveling of the agreed framework was executive branch congressional disconnect. And I'd pray that whomever is president understands the risk and makes it a top priority and sees it through. That's all.
Well, my suggestion is that the Washington National Symphony go to Pyongyang for a concert. I think the cultural aspects of this, as we've seen in all other types of breakthroughs with, with countries that we've had difficult relationships with, have come about a lot with cultural exchanges. They're non-threatening. Except if maybe it's a soccer game or something like that. That could really get tedious, but some things that are kind of easy to do, that don't threaten, that aren't really too much on the diplomacy and all this, but just, people to people exchanges. And we've seen how ping pong diplomacy was a part of opening with China back, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Did you know that in 2008, the New York City Symphony went to Pyongyang? Yeah. So, there's a great history of this. And for us to keep encouraging, and this is something that we can do in our communities. You could go to your symphony, to whoever, whoever's in the community that you think might be able to pull something like this off. And all of a sudden, you can make an overture to North Korea and don't even tell Washington what you're doing. Just go ahead and do it. Put it in the newspaper saying the LA, there you go, right here, Los Angeles. Say we've got Los Angeles in the house. And, go ahead and make this, we got to force the government. We've got to embarrass our own government to do what's right. It's just, I'm looking right up here. Democracy requires an informed citizenry able to question its government. Well, that's Richard Haas. And let me just tell you, 20 years ago, Richard Haas was in the State Department. And when I sent my dissent cable saying, I'm going to resign from the government over this war you're going to start with Iraq, it was Richard Haas that wrote me back saying, you don't know what you're talking about. You're out in Mongolia. And I was the deputy ambassador in Mongolia. And yeah, it was out there for sure. But I knew more about what was going to happen than he did, you know? So it is the informed citizenry, citizenry, and able to question its government. And so question it, question it, and don't even bother to question it. Just go ahead and do what you think's right. And let's see what happens.
Professor Young, may I ask you that next time you ask a question like that, let me go before Colonel Wright, because how in the world do you follow her? But let me try, because I very much agree with the comments she made about the importance of the cultural exchanges and the people-to-people exchanges. And of course, that's one of the places where women at DMZ is so important. So I'll answer the question first, and then I'll explain. So what I would do in terms of peace treaty, I would go and ask them, the North Koreans, and ask them now, because the situation is different than it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. And the reason for that is when I was in this sort of a situation back at the end of the Soviet Union, I was director at Los Alamos at the time. President George H.W. Bush was immensely concerned that if the Soviet Union breaks up, what's going to happen to the Russian, essentially the Russian nuclear intellect and the Russian nuclear materials. And that concern was relayed to me and the other lab directors at the time. And when Admiral Watkins, who was Secretary of Energy at the time, asked us, so what do we do? And my answer was, why don't we go ask them? Go ask my counterpart, their lab director, and say, what does he need in order to make sure that his people stay at home, that they don't sell their knowledge and capabilities? And I did. I went, and our government said, go ahead. And so I did. That was my first of 57 visits to Russia. So I asked them, and they told me as to what was important. And one of those important aspects, Colonel White, which you just pointed out, was the cultural exchanges. So I got to go to the Bolshoi Opera, and I got to learn about Russian history, about Pushkin, about Gogol, about all those things. And then our scientists started to work together, did experiments together. And then once we developed, enough trust in each other, then we started tackling the really difficult issues as to what one does about security and safeguarding of that enormous amount of nuclear materials. Let me just give you an example. So North Korea today, in my opinion, has less, approximately 50 kilograms of plutonium. Okay, the Soviets at the time Soviet Union dissolved had, we don't know for sure, but maybe close to 150,000 kilograms. The North Koreans today have maybe 1,000, 1,500 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. The Soviets had over 1 million kilograms of highly enriched uranium. And so this was an enormous job at that time. It took cooperation, and it took our having the empathy, with the Russians and this terrible, terrible economic situation they were in after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And we went and asked them. And so that's what I would do today. I would ask, the North Koreans, so how important is a Korean peace treaty? And how would you go about, getting to such a peace treaty? So that's what I would do. Sorry for the long answer.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could pursue a peace treaty or peace agreement through all 3 avenues that our panelists have talked about today? That would be such a breakthrough, right? The political end, demonstrating political will, and a political and bureaucratic process for achieving it. The citizenry pushing for it, and just simply asking the North Koreans, what do they want? What do they need to have a peace treaty, right? It sounds so simple. Unfortunately, it's not. All right, so please raise your hands with questions for our distinguished panelists. Yes, Anne.
think one of the most difficult problems we have. I'm Ann Frisch, and I work in Rotary because there is a tremendous audience there that is listening to us. And whatever you think about Rotary as being old guys sitting at desks with their cigars, well, there's still a little bit of truth to that. But it's a new audience. And they're saying, I never heard this before. So one of the things we can do is stop talking to ourselves and talk to other people. And very gently trying to get where they're coming from, but offering some presentations as we do. And one of the problems in the peace movement right now is that we have different analysis of who's at blame in the Ukraine war. And so we can't collaborate because we understand the situation differently. We should skip that step and go to, there is no good war. It doesn't matter who started it because everybody knows that the other guy started it. We know that from being kids, right? He started it, she started it. So we have to skip this first step of agreeing on the analysis and go straight to, there is no good war anywhere, and we have to stop the war. So one of the things that we can do first is stop demonizing anybody. Just stop it, because it means we don't have a good set of facts. That's what people demonize. I say they don't have a good set of facts. So it's like, I love it in this movement, in this room this week, that Dan and I disagree on some facts, but probably, you know, he's know more of his stuff than I do, and that's probably correct. But we agree on the outcome. I would say, if you know a Rotarian, tell them to come and talk to us, and we'll give a talk to their club. And we'll ask them to support sending a ballet to North Korea and ask one of theirs to come back. That's something Rotary can do. Don't ask them to get involved in the politics of it. Don't ask them even talk about it. Just do arts, music. They will do this. So get your Rotary club in your town, and every one of you has many Rotary clubs in your town.
So I'll start moderating from the floor. Who would like to respond to that comment?
I will. Not only talk to your Rotary clubs, but talk to your Kiwanis Club, your, hey, Veterans of Foreign Wars, your American Legion, your Veterans for Peace. But each one of you all have been to this for 3 days. Each one of you can write 150 words to letter to your editor when you get home and suggest any one of these things. But it's up to us to get our communities knowledgeable. And you're coming back from this experience. I hope each one of you will feel that it's your obligation to write something to your local newspaper. Thank you.
And never give up, never, ever. There are so many points of discouragement, right, Christine? That you reach a point where does this really matter? We cannot afford to give up.
Thank you. So let me recognize, Dr. Hecker.
No, I concur with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me establish an order. So there's a question here, a question in the third row, tail, and then a question here and a question there. So we have basically 5 questions lined up.
Thank you. To Ms. Wright's point about a symphony going to North Korea, the New York Philharmonic did go to North Korea a few years ago, some years ago. I talked to them when they got back to Seoul, and of course they had a good time, but it didn't lead to a heck of a lot. But beyond that, the real question is, how do you communicate with North Korea? All kinds of people who have tried to get through to them are not getting your response these days. There seems to be an impression that all you got to do is talk to them, but they're not talking back. Kim Yo Jong blew up a liaison office that South Korea's rather moderate, if not liberal president Moon Jae-in had built at considerable expense and high hopes. That was a great story when it happened, that she just blew it up one day. So how do you communicate? How do you get through this impasse? You all act as if it's so simple just to talk to them. Go ahead and talk to them, but they're not talking back. So how do you open up this communication?
I don't think any of us think it's so simple. They are not talking back. That exacerbates the risk, right? If we can't communicate at all, if we can't talk directly about our wayward soldier. So keep trying and keep finding new avenues and give some reason they should talk. I'm going to pound the table again about a focused effort on Korean War resolution. We got to demonstrate that we're serious about it. Simply saying in the last sentence of the Washington Declaration that we're open to discussions, not enough. I think the government is probably doing more than we see, but it's clearly not enough. We just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
Dr. Hecker, I believe you might have been the one most recently to North Korea. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think first I would emphasize the fact that over the years, although North Korea, is typically called the hermit kingdom or sort of the political equivalent of a black hole, that nothing comes out of there. That's just not true. So we've had the opportunity to communicate with the North Koreans over the years. And certainly the agreed framework was one of those points. But then after the agreed framework, even if the governments weren't talking, there was lots of communication through the track 2. In North Korea's case, it's really track 1.5. And so, for example, my 7 visits and the discussions from that are just part of the example. But the North Koreans talked a lot to the Americans. They send a lot of messages to the Americans. And then Kim Jong-un not only talked to President Trump, but he sent, what people call love letters to President Trump. It turns out that those letters were serious letters of discussion of where to go in the relationship between the two countries. So Kim Jong-un was talking to Trump. And then after Hanoi was just a debacle for the North Koreans. And so Kim Jong-un went home hurt, angry, and it took a while. He's still sort of stuck with it for a couple of years. Of course, President Trump met him there at the DMZ. And so there was still some communication. Biden administration came in. There was still perhaps some hope. And the Biden administration, of course, was very differently focused than the Trump administration. But then along the way, either through neglect of not getting sort of enough of a priority of dealing with North Korea, or also just this heavy focus on denuclearization, first. The North Koreans essentially got turned off. They watched the Americans, they watched the Chinese, watched the Russians, and that's what I say, by January of 2022 or so, they had decided they were no longer interested in normalization with the United States. They did not need to talk to the United States. And indeed, just this week's show of the Russian military leaders being there at the Weapons Expo in North Korea is just another indication that the world has changed. And so now getting them back to talk, it will really take a very different approach from Washington. They're going to have to realize even the door might be open, but it's going to lead to a different room. And we have to be prepared for that, but it's going to be tough. Thanks.
So much.
And I'll just mention, nobody's asked them if they want the New York City Philharmonic. So let's ask them. We've got to take the initiative on this.
Thank you.
Next question.
Just following up on that whole idea of people to people connections, how do we get around the travel ban? And I know there's a big lift the ban, but can we do it with a travel ban, or is there a way around that?
Sure. If you know, if there's enough popular support for whatever it is that we can create, then the State Department, I think, would be forced. I mean, if there's a groundswell saying we want to go to North Korea, and the North Koreans said, well, yeah, if you send them, we'll let them play at the whatever. I think the State Department, having been in that little organization for 16 years, not leaving on good terms though. No, that's, we have to force our own governmental bureaucracy to do what we think is right. So we can do it. And you're from New York City, Sally, so let's get moving.
Thank you. Our next question.
Oh, yes, I actually have two questions. One is directed, every panelist can answer, but especially to you, Dr. Hecker, about the US just sent nuclear capable submarines to South Korea. How possible is it, or how likely is it that those can be converted to nuclear armed submarines? And then also for the whole panel, I'd like to know, to what extent are different, I guess, companies that some might call the military industrial complex, to what extent do they have a vested interest in not reaching a peace treaty and keeping these nuclear tensions high?
Dr. Hecker?
So I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but the part that I did understand was essentially, so if the South Koreans would get nuclear powered submarines, can they turn that into nuclear arms? The answer is no. And it's a long and very different situation. You know, we've had nuclear powered submarines since Admiral Rickover's days. And at least to my knowledge, I didn't think we were going to turn those over, but General Leaf may know that better. There has been, you know, this very, very heavy duty discussion about the fact that the US has agreed with Australia in order to provide Australia with nuclear powered submarines. And there've been a lot of objection to that. I personally don't have any objection with that. Anything in the nuclear civilian arena, you know, might be able to be turned into some benefit for a country that wants to develop nuclear weapons. But as we've seen from all of the years of the experience that we have, in cases like this with the nuclear submarine to Australia, that does not concern me terribly.
Thank you for that. General Leaf and Colonel Wright?
First of all, I'd like to go back to Dr. Cumings' presentation this morning. The actual nuclear location, the submarines themselves in port, just doesn't matter. Because, and you left one part out of the triad, the land-based, US-based ICBM fleet. Okay, so that threat, some would say deterrence, others would call it, towards North Korea exists, and it's more the symbolism of the port calls. But the symbolism is, if I were North Korean, I'd be pretty upset about that. Having said that, having been the director of operations for U.S. Forces Korea and the deputy at PACOM, look at deterrence is really hard in all figuring out what works and how you do your job as a military leader, providing credible deterrence that doesn't incite. It's very difficult. So I wasn't in on the discussions at U.S. Forces Korea or PACOM about that decision. I would think it's a time to, there are certainly other ways to portray a stalwart, credible ROC U.S. alliance than shows. I would do it much more subtly.
All right.
Well, and also if you talk about, you know, nuclear things, whether it's that submarine that's sitting in Busan Harbor or whatever, I mean, you look at the amount of nuclear power plants that South Korea has. I mean, hell, they've got, I think, proportionally one of the highest number of nuclear energy plants. Not that nuclear energy goes directly to nuclear weapons or anything like that, but I mean, on the Korean Peninsula, there are lots of nuclear power plants.
If I may come back in, As I said, I didn't fully understand the question. So if the question was, the protocol of the U.S., Kentucky class submarine going to South Korea, that doesn't come anywhere close to the U.S. giving the South Koreans a nuclear submarine or doing anything to push them along the way of nuclear weapons. I thought you were asking some question where, for reasons I don't understand or I don't know, the U.S. has actually said it's going to give South Korea those. But just for the U.S. call of having the submarine, and that one is a boomer. In other words, it does have nuclear weapons on board. And as General Leaf pointed out, that was there to sort of demonstrate the U.S. has South Korea's back, and that deterrence is indeed strong. In my personal opinion, that wasn't necessary, for heaven's sakes. I mean, we're trying to get North Korea out of the nuclear business, and the way we're going to do them is to have a submarine that's loaded with nuclear weapons actually show up. However, as General Leaf also said, deterrence is hard. And it's particularly hard because it's so difficult to convince the country that you're trying to help with this extended deterrence. And I'm, for one, who thinks it would be an incredibly poor decision for South Korea to try to develop its own nuclear weapons. And so deterrence, is alive and well. We didn't have to send a submarine, but it is important, and it would be a very bad move for South Korea to try to develop its own nuclear weapons. It would make the Korean Peninsula less safe than it has been. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I also just want to get your word on whether you think the weapons industry poses like an obstacle to reaching a peace treaty.
Having been a vice president in a company in the weapons industry, no, I don't. Maybe I'm naive. They'll find business where they find business. The notion that any of the executives I worked with in the defense industry would actively oppose that, I just don't find credible.
Well, I've never been in the arms industry, and I think I have a different point of view. I think I think the weapons industry has a lot to do with our security policies, our offensive security policies, because they make a lot of money out of it. And the more that we can go after them to remind them there are, negative effects to their massive financial gains from all of this. I mean, we have the largest defense budget in the world. I mean, how many hours do you want us to talk about that thing, and who profits from all of that?
And we disagree, but we agree. I just think the responsibility lies with military and civilian leaders.
Oh,
the companies are going to make money where there's money to be made. So suddenly there was money to be made in aggressive humanitarian assistance. They'd
Well,
make it there.
I'm not
But
too
it
sure
comes
it's
from
humanitarian
government
assistance that we're talking about.
No, I'm saying that whatever, they respond to the market, and our military and civilian leaders make the market military capability.
Yeah, and just go through who all voted in the Senate for the largest military budget in the world and what the House is going to do. So go after every one of those that have been voting for all this stuff.
So we have what I believe is a follow-up question to that. So I'm going to let that questioner cut the line. Yes. So we're also about to close. So if the next three questioners could make it short, we have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, my question is simple. The North Korean side consistently says they want the U.S. to drop its hostile policy. They say this over and over and over and over again. And including recently, I've heard Kim Jong, Kim's sister, say this term, use this term again. It's never discussed here. Like, what do they mean or anything? I've asked Moon Jong-in, who's President Moon's advisor, about this, and they have a good understanding in South Korea what the hostile policy is that they're talking about. Like, how do they understand our hostile policy? How do you see that? what they understand as our hostile policy, what they mean by it.
I'm going to have the other two people ask their questions and then have the presenters quickly answer.
Thank you very much. I wanted to know, what advice would you give to the citizens to really make an impactful action against the military industrial complex, because it is affecting the lives of our children and their future because of the money that's spent on killing people instead of building them?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to ask, because I'm like 19, born long after the Cold War, like nuclear weapons exist as like an abstract concept to me, kind of. But like obviously the threat of nuclear disaster is like a big one, right? It literally, part of the reason it's so terrifying is that it literally exists outside the frame of reference of like what we can perceive as human beings and understand as human beings. And I think like global war too is also falls under that category, right? How do we like mobilize people in the US, like tie this broad fight to like more local contexts and struggles to like fold people in and show them that like all of these struggles are interconnected, that they should actively care about peace on the Korean Peninsula?
All right, so I would like to have our three distinguished panelists respond to these last questions very quickly. Dr. Hecker first, and then General Leaf, and finally Colonel Wright.
So let me start with the last question first, because that's what I've been trying to tackle for the last just about 19 years. As was said, you know, I spent 34 years at Los Alamos, 17 at Stanford, and now associated with a couple of other universities. And so my drive in all of those places has been to work with the young, in other words, the students. And so what I've tried to do, for example, in the nuclear arena, I've taught courses on nuclear, all things nuclear, is in nuclear, just like in everything else, you have to balance the good against the bad. And so the idea is in nuclear, the atom, by splitting the atom or fusing nuclei, you get millions of times the energy that you get from chemical reactions. And so that can give you a lot of good, but it also represents a lot of dangers. And that's what we should be focusing on today, is looking both the good of nuclear energy, and that is clean energy, nuclear medicine, space batteries and things of that nature, but then balance that against all of the difficult problems. On the industrial military complex, let me just say, yes, there is an industrial military complex, and President Eisenhower, on his way out of the office, sort of warned this country. I don't have a solution. Hostile policies, again, I've asked the North Koreans, and they'll give you chapter and verse. They're also very clever that they adjust their answer depending on when you ask and how you ask that. But they go all the way from everything as to what the US has done in places like Iraq and Libya and other places, and the fact that it, unlike the US, in the US, it's generally believed that North Korea has broken every agreement. The North Koreans view it very differently, and they see the US and the way that it's responded, you know, to its opportunities as being such as having hostile policy. I'll stop there.
Thank you, General Leaf.
Well, the hostile policy perception comes from the hostile environment. The hostile environment is the technical state of war. Another reason to solve it. However, we try to understand their view of that, we ought not do it through public exchange of statements. You know, it's something that has to be done pushing through to establish communications and having honest and open discussions. And then the last thing that goes back to some of the facts and figures that Dr. Cumings presented, we have to be seriously planning for a truth and reconciliation process, because that's what you do when you end a war, you know, kind of a thing. And if we're not serious about that, we won't get anywhere. I will acknowledge that if you have too much truth, you generally don't get to reconciliation. So you have to be mindful of how you do that. But we've got to do the hard stuff of talking about bad things in the process.
Well, you look at recent history and the times when North Korea did not explode any nuclear tests, and when they didn't shoot off any missiles was during Trump, during that period where we had active dialogue with them. So I would say you reduce, if not eliminate, land, sea, air exercises. You don't call any military exercises decapitation. And how do you get the people under 30 involved? Well, you invite them to things like this, where you have 30 under 30. You invite the young people to come to the things that you are already involved in, but invite them to come in and let them speak. You know, that's one of the things I think we maybe should think about the next time. We need to have the panel of 30 under 30 right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to our distinguished panelists and also to all of you in the audience. It's been an amazing hour and a half.
I'm blessed by it. Thank you.
Kathy, are you somewhere in the room?
Is it under here?
So I'm so pleased that Kathy Choi, who has been the amazing convener here, who you've seen running around making everything happen, is also very, very thoughtful and reflective person who can bring us all together now and summarize and bring us to a conclusion for this amazing day. So please let me introduce Kathy Choi.
I'm gonna steal the mic actually, and thank you, Linda. And we first had our conversation, and then in the course of that conversation, she mentioned that she had written a law review article about Diamond Kim. Does anybody know who Diamond Kim is? Okay, very few people. He was a Korean American who actually wrote, he published an independence newspaper from LA, and he was basically charged as a communist and deported during the McCarthy era. And I just couldn't believe that this bright young woman knew about Diamond Kim, and I just wanted to know more about her. And so in the course of becoming familiar with her work, she just completely impressed me from the very moment. And she helped us with her father, who is also here, set up a benefit concert for Women Cross TMC at the LA Korean American Musicians Association, LACMA, at the Walt Disney Hall, which was incredible and packed. And then subsequently had a screening of Crossings at Gyopo in LA, which was amazing, spirited community space. And she just handled this while working at a civil rights law firm in LA, where she represented victims of police brutality. I just fell in love with her. She has a law degree from Harvard, MA and undergrad from Columbia University. You would never know that because she's just so modest and humble and hardworking. And she has just completely bowled me over in the process of planning this 3-day gathering. I just can't even say enough how instrumental she has been in the success of this gathering, and especially enlisting and mobilizing the 30 under 30. The energy of these last few days is so beautiful because it's multi-generational, and the young people give me hope that we will end this war. And we absolutely need young leaders like Kathy. And so I'm just so honored to invite Kathy to give closing remarks and to just really thank all the wonderful team at Women Cross TMC, Kathleen, Chungwon, Susan, Yipum. Did I miss anybody? Echo, oh my God. Echo, the heart and soul, her spirited drumming. You know, I mean, look at the love and the power. And, you know, to the Wall Street Journal, this is the fake phony movement. I would disagree with you. So without further ado, Kathy Che.
Okay.
Can you get all the way across the end
Oh,
here so we can get a picture?
a picture? Yeah, we do after, we'll do after. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Christine, like making me cry. Before I was like practicing, I was like, I'm not gonna cry, but it already happened, so we're good. I just want to start by saying thank you to all the speakers and the panelists and all the activists and all the people who have come from so many far-flung places to be with us here in DC. Yeah, thank you to George Washington University. Thank you to Linda. We have been just working so hard together in concert. And Adam, yes, where's Adam? Thank you so much, Adam and Austin. I mean, all of our co-conveners, thank you so much. This is always a team effort. So as you know, today's conference marks the cap of a larger mobilization where we marched the streets and called for action and called for an end to this war. The activist Kelly Hayes has said, storytelling is a fight for our future. And we told a new story these past few days. At our opening gathering, we started with the question of who are you bringing into this space? As we have since gathered and broke bread and marched these streets calling for an end to this war, I have thought of all of the elders who have come before me. A major part of our gathering was intergenerational connections, as I'm sure you've gathered. And so I'd like to take this moment to recognize the 30 under 30 activists who are all here with us in this room. If you could just raise your hands, just raise your hands. They have each cleaned tables, served food, protected each other and built trust with each other in such a short amount of time in person. They have taken public speaking roles. They have written articles. They have just run the gamut. So I really bow to you all and I thank you all. You are all the future of this movement. So thank you so much. Thinking about our intergenerational connections and our elders, I think of many people. I think, for example, of Yoon Ra, who's standing obviously with the camera, always with the camera. Yoon Ra is a filmmaker. They are here with us today as part of the 30 under 30. And they have shared with us through media, their medium, the wisdom that comes from their grandfather, their 할아버지 in Ansan. You can find this clip online. I urge you to watch the full clip, but in short, translated, their grandfather shared wisdom that all of our ancestors believed, that all people and all parts of our planet are equally precious. I also think of Helen Kim, who is a Korea Peace Now grassroots network leader. And she has been with us these past few days and is totally fiery, fearless, amazing leader. And her grandmother is from Gwangju. And for those who know the Korean Peninsula, I think is Tim Shorak still with us, but Gwangju is a very significant place in Korea. And her harmony had told us that the war must never, ever happen again. And you can find her article. She quotes from her harmony's memoir that she found decades after. I think of also the grandmothers of Jeju-do, of Jeju-do. The Haenyeo. Jeju Island, for those who don't know, is a beautiful island off the coast of Korea. Known for three abundances: wind, woman, stone. The women divers are mostly elderly, 60 and older. The Haenyeo dive for minutes at a time, and they have intimate knowledge of their oceans. They have time and time again protested against the militarized destruction of their oceans and precious reefs and the dumping of nuclear waste most recently into their waters. I think of all of them, and I think of all of the aunties across the Pacific who have woven together resilient networks of care. They fought for a better future for me and for all of us who are sitting in this room. And history's tragedy is that
We may never know all of their names, but we have surely inherited their legacies, each of their legacies. I also think of my own parents and my own family who have persisted through so much. My father is here today, sitting here filming in this shirt right there. Yeah. Our family remains separated and divided by this ongoing war. And it is only through our ancestors' perseverance that I'm standing now here before you all. It is my honor to advocate for them and to fight for ending this war and for all generations to come. Unless we act, our communities and environment will suffer devastating consequences as our presence expands across the Pacific. The US recently announced a missile defense system to be built on Guam, which comprises up to 20 sites across the island and is built as a response to perceived threats from potential adversaries like China and North Korea. Quote, I'm quoting. This plan, like many in the past, will destroy precious landscapes and the livelihoods of people. In Hawaii, leaking jet fuel from Navy storage tanks has contaminated drinking water for thousands of families. And we have a large delegation from Hawaii here. I don't know if June is here. Yeah, from Hawaii. So yes, yay, June. June held up our banner throughout the entire march the other day. It's just so amazing. Yes, happy birthday, June, at midnight. So next year, the US will hold the Rim of the Pacific, which is the largest annual maritime warfare exercises in our oceans. Past exercises have killed untold scores of marine life. So we honor their struggles from Hawaii to Guam to the Philippines and to Okinawa. And when we fight for Korea, we fight for all occupied lands. We honor their struggles as they honor ours. And finally, I want to acknowledge that so much of this is only possible because 8 years ago, Christine An walked across the DMZ with 30 other women peacemakers from all across the world. Their march and their care for each other, their horizontal decision-making, you can see this in Crossings, which is now on World Channel and made its world premiere. Their work showed us that we can pave a new way forward. All of us here today have inherited their dreams and their resilience and deep courage. I hope each of us leaves this space and conference and mobilization today with a deep understanding that we all have a role to play for peace in Korea. Ours is a movement of life and of love, and together we will see an end to this war and peace in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This ends our program, but before you leave, please grab Christine if you have a check or cash or Venmo donation. We are still asking for donation. Many people ask me who to give the check, who to give the money for your hotel or, you know, for whatever. So please grab Susan or Christine if you're making the last donation before we leave. Thank you. Oh, and let's take a group picture. Sure, I think. Yeah, group picture here.
Yeah, you can take like a selfie.
Sit this way.
Okay. Yeah, picture like this way. Yeah.
So Kathy is suggesting let's